This is Sue Madden, the interviewer for the Oral History Project of the Newport Historical Society, and I'm at 62 Washington Street, the home of Esther Fisher Benson, who is the narrator, and it's April 16th, 1984. And we have been talking for just a few minutes and gotten a few basic pieces of information about Mrs. Benson, and so now we'll proceed with the first section of the biographical interview, which relates to the family. I'm going to be, some of these questions are repetitious, but so I hope you'll bear with me. Let's see, your birth date was
August 11th, 1908.
Okay. And you were born in Philadelphia, which you mentioned. Now, your parents were born in Philadelphia also?
My mother was born in New Jersey, but my father was born in Philadelphia.
Okay. And what was your father's occupation?
My father was the superintendent of the factory of the Exide Battery Company, and later the head of the development and design department.
Oh.
And he worked there all his adult life.
Okay. Now, I did find out his name was Edward Wanton, W-A-N-T-O-N Smith, and he died in 1940. Now, when was he born?
1875.
Okay. So he had this job virtually, I mean, with this company virtually.
As soon as he got out of college.
Oh.
He went to the University of Pennsylvania.
Okay. And your mother was from New Jersey. Now, did she have a job, or is that?
No, my mother didn't. She had gone to the Drexel Institute, so she had a degree.
Oh, well, now that was unusual.
It was,
yeah.
Yes. She had 6 children and a big house and servants, you know, the way people did.
Yeah.
So that kept her busy, but she had a lot of activities when her children got out of the home. She did a lot. She worked with the day nursery, and she did a lot of sewing during the war for the children in Europe and with the American Friends Service Committee. So she was a busy person too.
Were there any other volunteer activities outside the home that you can remember that your mother was involved in?
My mother did. See, the Morton Street Day Nursery, the American Friends Service Committee. I can't think of any. You know, she was down in Philadelphia, and I was up here, and I didn't know all of the parts of her life then.
No, and when she went to Drexel, what was her?
It was
her
what they
major?
called the home economics.
Oh.
They called it then. So she was a good dietitian and all that sort of thing. And when I was a girl, there were always people who would come to her for advice and things like the formula for the baby. And there was one time when there was a woman down the street whose baby had an awfully hard time, couldn't get the right food, and the woman said to my mother, "I don't understand, all these Italian children, babies, all their mothers give them is bananas and olive oil, and look at them." My mother said, "You go home and give your baby bananas and olive oil and see how she blossoms."
What about your father? Was he involved in outside activities in the community?
No, he wasn't. He was one of these men who has a workshop of his own and is forever making things.
Oh.
And he made awfully nice things. He made little steamboats that ran. He made sailboats that would go. And he had a lathe and spun little boxes and made brass trays. And he was forever making interesting things in his shop. Early on in his life, before he married my mother, he made a model aeroplane, which was sufficiently worthwhile for him to be remembered in the archives of the airplane museums in this country. And when I was a child, in his workshop, there was a big one that he was building up in the peak of the workshop. But my mother wouldn't let him finish it. She said she didn't want a dead husband. She wanted a life. So he's a very creative man.
It sounds like both your parents were. Now, brothers and sisters? You mentioned there were 6 children altogether?
6 children, 4 girls and 2 boys. My older sister, Sally, went to, after she graduated from Wellesley, she went to Japan for a year and a half and taught school.
Oh.
And when she was over there, she got scarlet fever. And when she came back, very soon after she came back, she began to be deaf. And this had kind of a difficult effect in her life. But she finally ended up at the Pennsylvania Historical Society, where she was for, more than 20 years. So she had a good working life there. And she's very good at all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
she lives in Jamestown. She's Sally Smith. You may know her. She walks around. You know, she's awfully nice.
Now, is her husband, did he
She
write
has
a
no
book?
husband.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's her brother, Edward Smith. That's my brother. See, the same name as my father. The book about the schooners.
Yes. Yeah. No, we went to a lecture at the Jamestown Historical Society.
He's such fun.
Yes, and I didn't have any money with me that night, and I wanted that book.
Wanted to buy the book.
And so they gave me the book, and then I had trouble finding out where they were at, but I guess they finally got the money.
Yeah, they're moving to Jamestown.
You know where I am.
You know, they're building a house in Jamestown, out at Hull Cove.
Oh.
So that's what Sally did, and Sally moved up here to Jamestown in about, I guess she's been here 6 years. She must have come 78. And then comes myself. Then comes
so you're the second oldest.
I'm the second.
Yeah, right.
Then my sister Anne died very tragically of a brain tumor when she was 29, so she went out of the family. And then comes my brother Bill, who also, William Horton Smith, and you see that connects him with the Horton family, connects us with the Horton family. He also worked for the Exide Battery Company all his life and was in this development and design.
And where is he now?
He is in Philadelphia still. Then I have another sister, Mrs. Lutman, who was married to an eye surgeon and finally divorced him and moved up to Newport. And she works for the Jamestown Garden Club. And then she paints a lot.
Yes.
Yes.
I have seen lovely things. And her daughter, isn't her daughter do wonderful
her daughter
knitting
does
work?
Wonderful knitting and work with her hands. Her daughter is so gifted. So gifted. Works at the Mystic Seaport. And then my younger brother, Ned, Edward Jr. he was. And I can't tell you what the name of his factory was, but he worked in a factory in Stamford, several different ones. I can't tell you, they're too complicated.
Okay.
But he and his wife, he retired 2 years ago, and they're building a house out at Hull Cove. And his wife was the daughter of Stanley Woodward, a painter from Rockport, Massachusetts, who was very well known in his day. So that's all my generation.
Well, I must say it sounds like a very interesting life for all of you.
Now, is this where you want me to tell you what I did?
Oh,
not yet.
Not yet, no.
Okay, fine.
But I'm curious at this point, your association with Newport and how you got here.
The house next door to mine, 64 Washington Street, has been lived in by my father's ancestors since 1759. And in 1759, when Thomas Robinson bought that house, and then during the Revolution, the Vicomte de Noailles was stationed in that house. One of the officers in the French Revolution stayed there. And Thomas Robinson's wife was Sarah Richardson, who was the daughter of one of our wonderful Newport men, Thomas Richardson. Anyway, the family went on, and finally, the daughter who was in that house in the Revolution was in love with an English captain. You know, the English were quartered here for 3 years.
Yes.
And her mother sent her over to stay with her uncle in South County, another Robinson, and poor Molly Robinson couldn't see her English lover. And he went off to war, and he was killed in the Battle of Yorktown. And it took her some years to...
Now, did the family send her over there for her safety?
No, so she wouldn't get entangled any more deeply with Captain Parkin, his name was. But she finally married a Philadelphia Quaker who was a good deal older than she was. And of course, he came up here to Newport to the yearly meeting. As you may know, one of the biggest, not just spiritual events, but social events in Quaker lives was traveling around to the different meetings. And so a lot of Philadelphia Quakers came up here to Newport.
Right, yes.
Just because we have had the great yearly meeting here, you know.
Yes.
And that's how John Morton met Molly, and then she married him and went down to Philadelphia, and she had her family down there. But in the meantime, Robinsons were here. And eventually, Molly's grandson, Benjamin R. Smith, inherited that house in about 1760. And he had it done
1760?
over. No, 1860.
1860, okay.
He had it done over, and interestingly enough, the man who worked on it for him was Charles Fallon McKim of before he was in the architectural firm. And so the room which had been the great fireplace room with a huge fireplace, McKim made into a parlor. And it's very
Remember
interesting.
That walking tour we took with the architectural historian? And that,
Did you go in there?
No, we didn't go in, but we walked around outside, and this was given as an example. Of, yes.
Mm-hmm. It's wonderful inside. They've had enough money to keep it up, and they've done it beautifully. So that's how it all happened. And then you see my father, who grew up, came here every summer. A long summer it was, too. Loved this house. And he always loved that
this
house.
house, you mean that house?
This house my grandfather owned. He had to buy all 3 other corners of the street to protect his house. He owned the Dennis house and the lot where the church was.
Yes.
He owned that before. But they were threatening a great commercial pier to go right out here.
Oh. Now, when you say out here, can you...
My house, right about where I'm pointing.
All right.
It's about in the middle of my yard. And in order to protect his property, grandfather bought this house and bought the Victorian house to save his house. And then this was rented for a long time.
Now, what year would that have been, approximately?
Well, I really can't tell you the year. I have no idea what the year was, but when it was. But he rented this one too. That was rented out to a society of nuns connected to the Episcopal Church. The Episcopal Diocese bought the land. I don't know whether it was the diocese or the church in Newport. Bought the land there and put up St. John's Church. And then, when I was a tiny little girl, there were 2 wonderful old ladies living in the Dennis house. Their name were the Mrs. Ferris. And they had this great, big, wonderful music box. And we were allowed to dress up in our best clothes and go over and have tea in little cups and have Miss Ferris play the music box for us. But then my grandfather had gone by this time. My father sold that house to the church. So that became a package of itself.
Okay.
And eventually, he sold this one to the Sisters of the Holy Nativity. That was their name.
This is the house directly across the street.
Yes, the Victorian one across the street.
And the other one you're talking about is the kitty corner one?
Yes.
Which is across from 64.
Yes.
Washington, okay.
That's right. So that my father used to come up for his 2 weeks vacation. He had 2 weeks of vacation. That's all he got from the excise company. And he came up for the first 2 weeks of September. And we all came with him and stayed with my grandmother. And of course it was wonderful. We came up in the Fall River boat. We took a train from Philadelphia to
that's a whole section
New York,
of questions.
And then we walked across Front Street and got in the Fall River boat. And we always got off at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
And grandmother would have a carriage down at the foot of the street. There were, of course, 4 of us, 5 of us, 6 of us. And they got us all organized, and the older children each had a younger one to watch out for. And the older children each had a bag. And the porter would come and knock on your doors when you went around Point Judith. And we were all waked up, staggering with sleep, and put our clothes on and got our little sister or brother and went down and got off the boat. And grandmother would have I guess it's a carryall, a wonderful carriage with a little top on it and a fringe around the top. And we'd get into this carriage, and I have the recollection that the drive from Long Wharf to grandmother's house was miles long. You know, I don't believe it's even a football field. And at the doorway would stand grandmother in a blue cotton crepe kimono with a candle. There were no lights in the Robinson house. There were only candles and oil lamps. And she'd have gingerbread and milk for us there on the table. And we'd come in still so sleepy, and then we'd just pile into bed. And then the next morning was just like heaven. We'd wake up and look out the window, and there was the water, and there was the green grass, and there was our father's capo. It was just perfectly beautiful. Of course, my father only wanted to be on the water. all his 2 weeks he wanted to be on the water all the time. And so his 3 little girls who came first were in the cat boat very early on, and we went a lot in the boat. It's funny, with 4 girls and 2 sons, my father never taught his daughters to sail the boat. We were the crew, and the boys learned to sail the boat. We were good at being crew, you know, but he didn't teach us to sail. Isn't that funny? So that, and then finally, in the end, my father got rid of the tenants in this house, and we came up. This is after my grandmother had died. We got too much for my aunt. See, by that time, my aunt, Esther Morton Smith, was in that house. And this is how you'll see why I'm called Fisher. My grandmother was Esther Fisher. My aunt was Esther Morton. I had a first cousin, Esther Morton, and then they named me Esther Fisher. So they called me Fisher, and I'm always called Fisher.
That's what Jennifer Tinges told me.
Isn't that funny?
Well, now I'm a little confused about. Now, can you tell me something about your grandparents? Did they live here year round?
No, they lived in Philadelphia.
They retired here?
No, he had the kind of business which I don't think any of us comprehends, where he could take the summer off. He was not a wealthy man. He had run a pharmaceutical wholesale business. And I don't know, but I think somehow in there he'd earned enough in the pharmaceutical business to not have to work very hard, or something like that. Yeah. We are very foggy on this, our family.
Yeah. Well, now, what was his name?
His name was Benjamin R. Smith. Benjamin R. Smith.
And how did he live to
yes, he did, but I can't tell you how old he was. See if I can. He must have died. He died before World War I. It must have been before 1908, before I was born, somewhere in there.
All right, but you have a lot of recollections of your grandmother?
Of my grandmother, yes. She died when I was 5, and I remember her quite clearly. She was very austere and wore what's the honey for dying? Wore black tight clothes with a very closely fitted and a little lace cap on her head. She was very pretty, but she was awfully gloomy.
So now, what happened to the house when they were in Philadelphia?
It was closed up.
Okay.
You could close houses up then. There was a man who lived down the street who looked out for it. He just was never broken into.
Now, was he? Did you say he was the one? Your grandfather was the one who inherited the house,
he inherited it from 2 Robinson cousins. Their names weren't Robinson. They were 2 old ladies who ran a boarding house there. One was named Williams. I can't remember their names. But they kept the house after the original Robinsons died. They were Robinsons. And until grandfather inherited it.
Well, you really need a chart to keep on.
I know it, you do.
Oh, that's just fascinating.
We have a lot of wonderful letters that Molly Robinson wrote back to her family here in Newport. They're perfectly wonderful letters. There's one, see, little Ben, my grandfather, used to come up here and spend the summer with those 2 old cousins. And this is how we got to love the house so. And we have one letter which says, the cousins are writing down to his mother. Little Ben has a friend who has made him a set of wooden tools. His name is Henry Goddard.
Oh.
Isn't that wonderful?
Isn't that something? Well, I've heard, I don't know, it doesn't matter what I've heard. I'm interested in what your opinion is as to why so many people from Philadelphia have come to the Newport and Jamestown area.
I think it's the Quakers. I think the Quakers brought them. Of course, this Wharton family
what about the Navy? I've also heard that...
Well, the Navy brought a lot of people, but not necessarily Philadelphia. But of course, we had the great shipyard in Philadelphia at Camden. Mm-hmm. And so that, if you're talking about Navy tie-ins. But my grandmother, Esther Fisher Wharton Smith, who lived in that house every summer for a long time, in the early days, she had her mother come up. Her mother was Deborah Fisher Wharton. And Deborah Fisher Wharton was the mother of all of those Whartons in Jamestown. And in the beginning, they came here and stayed in boarding houses.
No, she came because
she came to stay with her daughter.
Because her daughter had married someone who was
owned
here.
This house. Yes.
And then they discovered.
And they came up and yes, they discovered Jamestown, the island, Connecticut. And they were, both of them were wealthy men. Charles William Horton and Joseph Horton were both wealthy men.
Now,
and they bought vast amounts of land. Whose father?
No. She
was married to William Horton.
Oh, okay.
And he died. William Horton and Deborah Fisher Horton were the ones who were the ancestors, the parents of all this great Horton clan. There were 9 Hortons. It's no wonder nobody can keep them straight. But see, there's Rosamond Horton is the widow of one of them. And her father was not in the same generation as my father. Not her father, her husband. Her husband was in a generation nearer to me. It was his father that was in my father's generation because of this huge Horton family. My grandmother being down at the bottom, and Charles William being up near the top. So you see, the generations get so confusing when you had these big families. Uncles and aunts would be the same ages as grandchildren and nieces and nephews. So it's why there's such a confusion here. But that's why it happened. Then those men went over and bought these wonderful pieces of land and put up those great houses. And that brought a whole bunch of people up here. But I think, I don't really know why some of the other Philadelphia Quakers came up. I think it's kind of the Quakerism. The shoemakers were all Quakers. They came up to Jamestown. That's not part of my story. No, maybe somebody else can tell you.
Okay.
Sally, my sister Sally might know more about this.
I want to go back to your childhood now, and can you tell me some of the things that your family did together? Let's.
You mean here in Newport?
Yeah, let's keep it to Newport.
Well, we sailed. We went in the boat.
Yeah, you mentioned the boat. Okay.
That was all. We had these wonderful picnics, and we'd
now,
make.
Where would you go on the?
We'd go to Hope Island. We'd go around Beaver Tail to the Bonnet. We'd go to Lawton's Valley. We'd go to Prudence. We had a regular series of places we could go, depending on which way the wind was blowing. It was really a lovely thing to do. We all got into this catboat.
Now, did your mother go too?
Oh, yes.
And all the kids?
Went wearing a straw hat and knitting or sewing all the time. Oh, yes, all the kids. I had one sister, the one who died of the brain tumor, who used to get seasick. She felt badly on the boat. She didn't get seasick. So when she got older, she didn't go on a lot of them because of this. And she eventually went to camp in the summer because she was miserable on the water. It may have had something to do with that tumor in her head. I don't know. But then when we began to live here all summer, see, that's not so
we didn't
far
get
back.
To that. Okay.
Then we went over to Second Beach to swim a lot.
Now, when did you start coming here? For the
1924. We came up one summer, the summer of the polio summer. There was a summer there, it's something like 1917 or 1918. There was a terrible epidemic of polio in the Eastern Seaboard. And so my father didn't want us at home down in New Jersey, which was the place we went in the other part of the summer. He was afraid of our catching polio, and he got rid of the tenants in this house. And we stayed one summer in this house when we were still quite little. See, 1918, I was only 10. And I remember that vaguely. But it wasn't until 1924 that we came up for the full summer, and from then on. And then we were here from then on every summer for 2.5 months anyway.
Well, then that was heaven.
It was wonderful. We had a wonderful time. That's how I met my husband, of course, coming here in Newport. But we were, a lot of girls who have a great deal of fun. And Mrs. Berry would come up with her sister, Mrs. Newell. See, they were our first cousins. And we lived in the 3rd floor of this house. It was a girls' dormitory. And we just raised the dickens up there. We were such a bunch of lively girls. You wouldn't believe it.
That's wonderful. Now, when you were here as a child in the summer, did you stick together with your brothers and sisters,
yes.
or did you meet the neighborhood children?
Very many people. We did meet the Belknap girls, and one summer we played with the Belknap girls, Avril and Amelia and Rowan, who's still here. And we knew the McLeods. We knew Edith Ballinger Price very well. And she was part of our life, though she went to Matunic in the summer, so we didn't know her so very much, but we did know her. Well, we stuck together. It was only 2 weeks. It's only 2 weeks. That's a short
So
vacation.
when you came for the whole summer beginning in 1924, at that time you were
8 from 14. I was 16.
16. Oh, so you were.
Yes. I remember that because I took my driver's license test here in a Model T Roadster, and I had to go down Thames Street, which was two-way traffic. I had to go down Thames Street. That was the test they put you to, driving down Thames Street.
And you passed?
Yes, I passed. I don't know how, but I did.
Any other recollections about what your family did together?
Well, my mother quite often we used to go across the ferry and see some of our Horton cousins.
Okay.
Or my father would sail us over to Mackerel Cove, to Horsehead, to call on Mrs. Morris. That's Kit Wright's mother.
Yes.
And we used to go there always one visit per summer. Then my mother always took me, because I traveled better than my other sisters. She took me up to Providence to meet her Providence relations, because although my mother was born in New Jersey, her family came from Providence. Her father worked in New Jersey.
I see.
So that she always took me up there, and we'd have to go by train to Fall River. And then I think it was a trolley that took us from Fall River to Providence. It was the most lengthy process. See, that's when I was really little, because it's before we had a car.
Mm-hmm.
I never thought of that before. And we'd go see some of her cousins that she was fond of up there. But we didn't do much up there. We had lots of things we did. We walked in the rocks. You know, you're forever walking on the rocks. We rode in boats. Yes, all.
Yeah. I was just looking for a sleeping bag.
What color is it?
Blue. It's dark blue. I don't think.
Well, Dad knows where it is. You'll have to ask him.
Now, you mentioned going to Second Beach,
Yes.
but you didn't say too much about
Well,
that.
I'll tell you how we did that, and that's after 1924. We got to know Richard Berry and his family very quickly when we came up in 1924. And of course, Richard Berry was one of 3 boys. And with all of those girls up on the 3rd floor, you know we had a lot of boys coming over here. And the Berrys came all the time.
Was that at this house?
This house.
This house. Okay.
See, this is 16 when we were in our teens. My sister Sally was 18. I was 16. My sister Ann was 14. My brother Bill was 12. You know, we went right straight down the line. So by that time, we were a bunch of loud teenagers. And Richard Berry's father had a little bathhouse put up at Second Beach. There was nothing on Second Beach. Absolutely nothing. It was the most beautiful beach you ever saw. But at the St. George's End, there were something like 3 or 4 little individual bathhouses which were owned by people in Newport. That's all there were. And of course, I don't know when the deal was made, because St. George's owned that end of the beach. But we used that bathhouse. The Berrys turned it over to us. And every single afternoon we'd go over there for a swim. And we'd pick up my husband at the John Stevens shop. And we'd all go over there and have this lovely swim. Until the 1938 hurricane, when it was blown away.
Yes.
All those bathhouses were blown right out. But that shows you the development of Second Beach didn't come until much later. Well, there was a time in there when automobiles went on the beach, and they really made a mess. It was an awful mess then, before the city of Middletown began to take it over.
Let's see, we've asked a question.
We went to Quaker meeting.
Oh. Okay.
My father was in Jamestown. My father would sail us over on Sunday morning to Quaker meeting in the catboat.
Yes.
And we would have made a picnic. And then all of us little girls, we'd have to row the boat. We anchored the catboat out, then we rowed the little rowboat in, and we'd have to take our shoes and stockings off to get onto the shore. Then we'd walk up Whedon Lane barefoot. We'd put our shoes and stockings on when we got to the top of the hill. And it always seemed to me as if my father was very careful to have us come a little bit late, because he wanted us to be able to bear the silence for a half an hour, not an hour. Or he thought it would be too much for us. So we came in a little late, and it wasn't so long. And we went there.
Now, why would you go there?
This was closed down.
Oh.
This was just a great arc of a building, which had a few recreation things in it.
Yes.
It was connected to, but it hadn't turned into anything yet. There was no meeting there. No medium salad. So that was great fun. See, then we'd come back and we'd have a picnic. But Taylor's Point was also simply beautiful. There was a lovely beach, and the sand went way, way, way out. I don't know what happened to all of that sand. And we went there a lot and swam off the boat. See, that was an easy, you could do that in 2 or 3 hours. It wasn't a day's trip. And so we had a lot of fun over there.
Were there any other relatives in this area? Now you mentioned Debbie.
Well, Debbie Barry and her sister.
Now what was Debbie's maiden name?
Debbie's maiden name was Rossmassler.
Okay.
My mother's sister, Marjorie Atwater, married an Edward Rossmassler. So they came up and spent the summers with us often, or spent a month with us. And my grandmother Atwater came up and would spend a month with us in the summertime. So, but this
so were there any other
well,
relatives?
there were, yes, I'll tell you who there were. My father had a much older sister named Anna Wharton Smith, and she married a Dr. Henry Austin Wood from Boston, Massachusetts. He was a doctor. In fact, he was a very fine doctor. He made the first appendectomy operation in the Boston area. And he had a practice in Waltham, Massachusetts. And they had 4 children. And they used to spend, when they were little, they spent the whole summer in that house with first my grandmother and then my aunt. And when we came, they had to get out. See, so they didn't like it very much. But as soon as we got this house, then they could come. And we knew them well. There were 4 of them, 2 boys and 2 girls. And of course they were a lot older than we were, because my Aunt Anna was much older than my father. Mm-hmm. But we were very close to them. Knew them all. And of course it was one of them, Henry Austin Wood II, who inherited that house. So that house is now in the Wood family, and it's owned by Henry Austin Wood II's 2 children, who are in their 50s. Their names are Henry Austin Wood III and Anna Wood Murray. So that's where that house is now.
Whew, let me see. I cannot believe how you pull all these names and dates and places. It's wonderful. Did anyone live with your family besides the immediate family?
No, of course we always had it. We always brought a cook and a second girl out with us until after, when did we start? Even when I was married, my mother still came up. She came up for a month in the summer, and she brought a cook with her so that I got a rest from cooking. But no, we didn't bring anybody else up. But we had visitors, you know.
Yeah.
When this crowd of girls was here, sometimes we'd bring some boys up from Philadelphia and they'd stay here. But we didn't have anybody else.
What kind of future did your parents have in mind for you, do you think?
Well, my father said he never sent his daughters to college to scrub floors. He came up once and found me scrubbing the floor. That's funny, because in the springtime, when Sally and I were at college and Ann was at college, we opened the house. We had a wonderful time. We'd come down in June after exams.
Now, where were
Sally
you
and I were at Wellesley, and Ann was at Mount Holyoke. And Sally and I would drive down. By that time, we had a Model A Ford. And we'd drive down into this house, and we would scrub it from top to toe. We'd put all the mattresses out in the lawn to sun, and we opened all the windows, and we just did everything and got it all ready, and then my parents would come up. And so we were used to scrubbing this house. But that's a little different than my father having me marry somebody. But, you know, it was hard for my parents' generation to accept the changes that happened as a result of what? Do you know why? Suddenly there were no people to help you in the houses. You had to do it all yourself. And of course that happens now everywhere. We don't think anything about it. But this was a change. It wasn't a change in necessarily monetary status. It was a change in availability of people who were willing to be domestics. There wasn't that class in life anymore. Now, when you have somebody clean their house, they're a professional. And quite rightly, you pay a decent sum for it. They get a decent wage for it. I can't tell you any more than that, but...
Okay. So the children were expected to go to college in...
Yes, we all went to college. My father sent 6 children through college.
Wow.
I don't know how he did it. He did. We all went, yes.
So you went to high school in...
We all went to a great big Quaker school in Philadelphia called the Germantown Friends School. We all went to it, and then we all went to college. And we didn't come out. We weren't the kind that would come out in society.
Was that because of your Quaker background?
Well, I would think partly.
Yeah.
I would think certainly partly, but also because I think my father believed in women's intellect and women having a, doing something. He was disappointed that when Sally and I got out, why don't you close that curtain so you don't get such a draft on you?
I'm not getting
don't
draft,
feel
but
it?
are you uncomfortable?
Oh, it says a
All
little.
right.
Close the 2 ends of it.
Yeah.
First Sam opened one and then Oliver opened the other. He was disappointed when we got out of Wellesley that Sally and I were not prepared to work. And Wellesley at that time didn't approach you that way.
You didn't have the skills?
We had not taken the things in college which would have enabled us to work. The only one that really was available in Wellesley was teaching.
Mm-hmm.
And neither Sally nor I wanted to teach. But there was no counseling service or anything in Wellesley to say now, Miss Smith, what are you expecting to do after you get through? Are you going to, prepare yourself to earn a living? There was nothing like that. And then, of course, Sally got out of college in 1930. I got out in 1931, and it was at the very depths of the Depression. And we were asked, the government asked you, if you can feed and clothe your children, do not take a job away from somebody who needs it. And we were not encouraged to get work. My sister Sally worked for a social service agency, but I didn't have any work. I went down to the Kentucky mountains with the American Friends Service Committee, and I worked in the coal mines for 2 years.
Oh my gosh.
I served lunch for the school children in Pike County, Kentucky for 2 winters. And of course for that I got my living in $25 a month. And it was a great life, let me tell you. And then I got married, and
I'm going to get to that. You mentioned that your family were Quakers. And you went to church regularly?
My grandmother Atwater, although she was born and bred a Quaker, left Quakerism because she said it was so bigoted and so narrow, and they didn't allow you to sing and play music. This was in the mid-1800s. She became a Unitarian. But my grandfather Atwater remained a Quaker, and he was a very unusual Quaker. He was a very broad-minded, wonderful human being. One of the real prizes in my family was this grandfather. He had these 9 children, and when he left the job in Millville, New Jersey, took all of his children to Berlin, and he studied chemistry in Berlin. And then he came back to the United States and worked for the DeSalve Process Company in Syracuse, New York, until he retired. So all his children learned to speak German. And then after he retired, he went to Paris and lived there for 3 years. And his children went over and stayed with him. They were all grown, and they all learned to speak French. So you see, he had a very wide approach to life. He didn't take them over as dilettantes or as travelers. They went there to live in the context of the cities where they were. So that all of his children had a very diversified point of view on life. Well, fine, but grandfather always went to meeting. Now, my mother was a Unitarian. She couldn't stand to go to meeting and hear tiresome people talk. As you know, in Quaker meeting, anybody can speak. And she got very upset by tiresome speaking. She said she'd rather pay a good preacher any day. I know she was going to get something good. But my father, who also didn't go to meeting for a long time because he was so upset that so many of them didn't believe in evolution.
Oh.
And he wouldn't go. See, you have to trace this back to his college.
Yeah.
When he was a young man, he wouldn't go. But in his 40s, he went back to Quaker meeting and decided it was more important to be worshiping there together than fussing about the tiny little differences in people's thoughts, the little dogmatic differences. And then my mother came with him, and we all went. So you see, it's as if having left Quakerism, we came back with a deeper devotion to it than some of the people who stay all the time.
In terms of the time sequence, when did you start going to?
I must have started going, well, it's somewhere around World War I would think.
But
Somewhere around
you
World
went
War
to a Quaker
school all my life.
School all your life.
Oh, yeah. See, my father went to that school. And Quaker schools are excellent schools. And they have a very good reputation.
Yeah.
But there wouldn't have been any. And of course, we went to meeting in school. Thursday morning, you had Quaker meeting. And my aunt was there, and she used to, Esther Morton Smith, she always gave a nice sermon for the children. She'd get up and say something awfully nice, which was really right where they could think and understand it. So you can see I had a lot of Quaker meeting in my life.
With the Quaker faith, how did one spend the Sabbath? Other
By
than going
the
to
time
the
I
meeting?
was a Quaker, you were no longer a narrow-minded Quaker. Quakerism has allowed itself to grow, and I think it's very important. And Quakerism isn't a puritanical religion. It's a religion of love and light. It's not meant to be one of narrow backbiting, which some of them are. And so to be happy and praise the Lord by enjoying what He provides for you was one of the things. And we were brought up, I think, happy children. We were brought up with a sense of duty and all that sort of thing. And of course, early on, you go to Quaker school, you get all of that, the Quaker things which came up early in the 20th century, which is the American Friends Service Committee. This is the devotion to works of mercy. And that's something that's just grown up in the 20th century. And we almost all of us got somewhat involved in it. See, my 2 years in the mountains and things like that. And it's preached to you. It's in the very essence of Quakerism, is helping other people. It goes way back, way back in Quaker.
What about holidays? Are they
Holidays
celebrated
were
any
just
differently, or
no,
were they downplayed?
No.
Or?
Well, when my father went to school, holidays were downplayed. They didn't have school on Christmas, but they had it just up to Christmas, because they said every day was the Lord's Day. Every day, and that you should worship and behave yourself every day. So it was a little different, but by the time we were growing up, it wasn't. We had the same holidays and everything as other people.
Is there anything else while we're on the subject of religion that you think might be worth adding at this point? You can always stick it in later if it comes up, but I don't really have any other questions, but your descriptions are so wonderful. I don't want to miss anything.
I think the thing that is so it's the habit of silence. The habit of worshiping in silence is if you've done it all your life, as I have and my sisters have, it means a great deal to you. I suppose it's a sort of meditation. But this is the core of Quakerism. It's worshiping in silence and feeling the Spirit working inside of you and helping you. I don't know what else to say. That is what Quakerism is all about.
When you would go to the Quaker Meeting House over in Jamestown on Sundays, was that were there a lot of people there?
Well, there must have been 10 or 15, but there weren't a lot.
Yeah.
And nowadays there may be 8 or 9 that go there regularly.
And it's just open in the summer, right?
Just open in the summer for all of those Philadelphia Quakers. There's one bench, they're very narrow benches. There's one bench that you sit on, and on the back of the bench ahead of you is scratched in the wood. Whose stomach is grumbling? Not mine.
Oh, that's wonderful. Maybe at this point we could get into how you met your husband.
Well, I really met him at the Art Association. The Art Association in Newport was then run by 2 very dramatic women, Maud Howe Elliott, and also there was Helena Sturdivant, who was a painting teacher, and they ran the Art Association, and every summer they had most summers they had a pageant to raise money to pay the coal bill or whatnot, you know. And that's how we met John Howard Benson. And he taught etching up there and lithography. And he learned a lot there himself, and he also taught printing. He had a printing press. But he was this great, big, tall thing, 6'4", skinny, great big feet. He was called the boy with the big feet. Very soon after we met him, he began coming over to the house, and he was one of our followers. We had this great group of followers.
Now, what year was this?
This would have been in 1924 or after. See, when my husband was then 23. And he would come over, and we'd all, he didn't have the John Stevens shop until 1927. That's when he bought the John Stevens shop.
And that was a stone?
The stone cutting shop,
okay.
Yes. So that he wasn't coming over after work then. But we would see him quite a lot. And I remember he used to ride a bicycle down here with those long legs. And he had a friend named Frank Donaldson who had long legs. And Frank would sit on the front of the bicycle. And my husband would be driving the bicycle. And they were the funniest sights you ever saw. They were both so tall and long-legged. But we had lots of fun with him. But I think less in those beginning years until he bought the shop. See, he did all sorts of things in the summers. He went...
Now, was he a year-round person
Yes,
here?
his family lived here. He was a year-round person.
Okay.
And he went to the Art Students League in New York in the wintertime to study. And then he came back and had to work in the summers. One summer, this is before I knew him, he was on the Fall River boat. He was a purser. And then he did various things. But we didn't know him well until he got the shop and it was permanent in the summer.
Now, where was the shop?
The shop was on
located?
Thames Street.
Okay.
29 Thames Street. But he early on began taking us into the old graveyards on the island. You know, Newport is filled with wonderful old graveyards.
Yes, I know.
And he took us into them and began talking to us about art, not just gravestones, art. He educated our whole family and the kids in the field of art. We had a wonderful time with him. And he talked Greece and Rome and Renaissance Italy, you know. And he twice in his life, he got a job in the summer being the lecturer on the Olympia tours, which was a ship that went around the Grecian islands. And he had a wonderful time doing that. And then, of course, he'd come back and we'd hear all about it. But see, there were 2 summers he wasn't here. Anyway, that's how I met him. And he went on lots of our picnics and went in our sails, and we swam and rode around here and had a lot of fun.
And then when did you get married?
We got married in 1934.
This was after your 2 years in
Kentucky.
In Kentucky.
Yes. I'd had another year at home in Philadelphia. After Kentucky, I worked in 3 or 4 community centers. I taught folk dancing.
Oh.
I had a wonderful black friend who played the piano beautifully. She'd play all the tunes, and I'd teach the kids in the community centers. Settlement houses, they were called then. I taught them folk dancing. So I did that for a year. And that spring, we got engaged. In June, we got engaged and got married in September. And then we moved up here.
Now, were you married in Philadelphia?
No, we were married out of that house. My aunt was away that summer. She was sick. So my father and mother came up to that house. And so I was married out of the ancestral house, which was, of course, very nice.
Yes.
And my husband was a Roman Catholic, and we were married in St. Joseph's Parish House. And then we had just a small reception next door. And then we found out that summer, before we got married, we found out that we could make an apartment in this house, which was on the north side.
64?
This one.
Oh, this one.
On the north side of the house, which was certainly picking the cold side. But it ran better. It ran along. And there was a big servant's bedroom out in the back, which we could make into our bedroom. So we fixed it up, and we stayed there for, how many years? We were there until my father died, living in that apartment. It was terribly cold. We insulated it finally and got it some better. But I can remember the first year we were in that bedroom, the rug would raise up off the floor with wind. And the little bathroom, the water would freeze every night during the cold part of the winter. So we got absolutely used to getting hot cloths and putting them around the pipe. We never had a broken pipe. Isn't that funny? You just get used to knowing how to arrange these things. We had a great big iron range, coal range. It was wonderful down in the cellar underneath the kitchen and that underneath our bedroom, and that was wonderful. It supplied all our hot water. Remember when I told you how we'd come down to open the house?
Yeah.
The kitchen range had been stuck in the old fireplace, the great big fireplace.
That's right. Okay.
And it was stuck in the hot water boiler. And the first thing we girls would do would be to get that fire going. So we'd have hot water next morning. So all of us girls learned how to start a coal range. And I think back to myself, that's one of my great achievements. That I knew how to start and run a coal range. And I did it, of course, in that cellar underneath our bedroom. And whenever I had anything to make, like a big stew or a chowder, I'd make it down there. Or boil lobsters, because there was that wonderful heat. But in the 38 hurricane, that whole place was just, that range was just picked up and thrown around like this. You wouldn't believe it.
Oh, we have a whole section of questions on that. So you've lived in Newport
in
full
this
time.
House. Well, it wasn't full time. For 2 winters. The winter of 19.
You were married in 34.
I was married in 34. Let me see. Tom was born in 1936. My first son was born in 1936. And the fall of 37 and the fall of 38, we went up to Providence and lived in an apartment up there while he organized the sculpture department at the Rhode Island School of Design.
Oh.
And see, that takes us through. Then my next son was born in 1939. See, that's after that year.
So Tom was born.
Tom was born in 36.
Yeah.
And John was born in 1939. And
what about your third son? While we're on
43.
Okay.
Now wait, there's something I've got to get in here. The summer of 38 was the hurricane.
Right.
And we had a series of tragedies in my family. That was the year my sister Ann was found to have the brain tumor. And after the hurricane, my father came up to see the damage, and we took him and showed him all this damage to the property. Oh, the waves had broken on the back of the house, and they'd filled the cellar, and the pier was all battered, the seawall was battered. We lost great parts of the Captain's Walk. And of course, our damage wasn't as bad as some other people's. The whole city pier was on our front lawn.
Now, were you in Providence during the hurricane?
No, we were right here.
Here.
Tom and I were right in the window.
September 21st.
Tom and I were right there.
Oh,
this is why we went up early that year to Providence. We went up about the 1st of October. We went right up to Providence.
Because of the damage.
Otherwise,
here?
I didn't go until it got cool, you see.
I see.
It went on the weather, yes, because of the damage. We moved right out. But my father came up and he looked at all this damage, and he didn't express any distress or anything. Finally, he said, "I have something very sad to tell you. We found out that Anne has a brain tumor." And you see, the whole thing was thrown into a different perspective by the fact that my sister she had a brain operation that fall, and then she had been married. She was married, and then she later on had X-ray treatments on her head. But in about 3 years, she died. 3 years.
Did she have any children?
No.
Yeah.
She died in 1939. And see, this was. Gosh, I haven't got my time right in here, have I? Yes, that's right. We found out she had the brain tumor. I don't know whether I messed up in here or not. Anyway, then the next year my father had a cancer of the stomach. Very bad. And he was operated on. And he died. And the year after that, my aunt, Esther Morton Smith, had a cancer, and she died. So there were 3 years when one member of the family died of cancer. And so we had a very hard time there. And my mother didn't smile, didn't laugh for 2 years. She didn't laugh for 2 years. And after that, you see, my father's will, I got the house.
This house.
This house.
Yeah.
And my sister Sally and my mother would go over and they rented a little house from Mrs. Wright for 2 or 3 years until they found the Hull Cove house. And then they bought the cottage at Hull Cove. And then they came up there every summer. So that's how my family got switched over to Jamestown. and how I stayed in this one. Of course, my husband was terribly pleased to have this house. He'd always loved it, and he used to tell me, I married you so I could get this house.
So you have been a full-time Newporter
Since 1934.
since 1934.
Yeah.
And you've always been in this
Yes.
in this
yes,
house.
I have. Mhm.
So you really
There was one time when after my second child was born, I had phlebitis, and in those years they didn't operate on you for phlebitis. You lay still and had an ice bag on the place where the inflammation was. So I was in a nursing home for 3 months, and my son Tom went down to Philadelphia, was taken care of by Mrs. Lutman. And then when I could get up and walk and take care of the family, we rented a place, an apartment up in Newport. And that's the only time. Oh, we rented one the next winter too, because this was too cold. See, these are the 2 years before my father died.
Oh, okay.
See, when it was too cold for me to stay here, and he could go up to Providence by bus. These are all before 43. So these are, I can figure out the time for you. If the dates are very important.
No, it's just get some kind of.
Well, so for 2 winters we were in Providence, and 2 winters we had apartments we lived in. And then my father died, and I got the house, and my mother helped us, and we made over, put in a new furnace, and made it over for our living quarters. And that has to be 40 and 41. I remember because we just got the copper piping before the World War II said no, people can buy copper piping. We just got it in time. And that was surely 41, wasn't it?
Yeah. Right.
See, and he died in 40, so that's the fall of 41 it was.
In terms of this neighborhood here,
Yeah.
which is the one that you've been associated with all your life, have you seen? Can you talk about how it's changed, or what your recollections were as a child, and what it was like in terms of the neighbors? You mentioned the sisters that you visited and would get all dressed up.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any other recollections of people or events, or from the early days?
Well, from the earliest days until Restoration began to take hold in Newport. See, Washington Street was a completely separate street and had these beautiful houses on it which people had taken care of. But back from the point was slums. From right straight up to 10th Street, it was all very poor housing, and the colonial houses were made into cold water flats. They were very poor, absentee ownership.
Yeah.
And
Now,
people who didn't
what did
care.
you call the point?
The point originally, by that I mean in the colonial period, this was a point of land which
Yes.
was met by Long Wharf.
Yes.
See, and in between was a great cove, which
Right.
is where the railroad tracks are.
Right.
And this is what was called the point. But now the point is from Washington Street up to Farewell Street and down Marlborough Street. That's the point. Up to the Navy base. And that's what we call the point now, the area. So that the children that came down to play in the water, because of course lots of children came down to play in the water, were the poor kids from up here. And we did know most of them when we talked with them, when we swam with them, But it wasn't much more than that. We were certainly on a talking basis with them. So I knew lots of families. I knew a Hackett family, and 2 of those brothers ended up soft alcoholics. It was terrible, poor things. And I knew a family named, lived right up in the little old house. Well, maybe I'll think of their name in a minute.
Was
Then
there a sense of community spirit here that you were aware of as a child? That
Well,
you
there
were
was
separate from
no, but
the other areas
we knew
of
everybody
Newport?
in the old houses,
Yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
We knew, though you see, you go back to those 2 weeks, and we weren't here long enough.
And there were enough in the family to
Yes.
that you
And then the
didn't have-
cousins came.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until 1924, when we stayed the whole summer, that we began knowing people. But we didn't mix too much into the Newport community. When we were in those pageants for the Art Association, and they also were for the Historical Society, we got to know some of the Newport people. And then, I don't know what year, I think it's 1936, yes. They had things called, it was long before that. They had Old Port Day here on the point, which was sometimes to raise money for the church for the coal bill. And sometimes it was for the Historical Society. And 2 or 3 blocks here on Washington Street would be hedged off. And we had a whole lot of wonderful things that this Old Port Day provided. There would be children's dancing in one yard. One year we had a sampler collection here in my house, which we got from the Historical Society. There'd be a concert. It doesn't seem to me that we sold much. It wasn't really a selling fair. We had a parade. Everybody who lived in the houses wore costumes, and we'd have a parade up and down the street. The concert would be in the church. We'd have an organ concert. King Colville would give an organ concert. Sometimes there was a pageant. Anyway, we did that for years, and of course we met a lot of people. We knew the Colville children well. I should have brought them in earlier. We knew them the earliest because they lived right in the Colville house up the street, and we knew all of them, Betty and King and Robert. And so that we did mix with the street somewhat. We didn't. We had cousins who came down to stay with the McLeods, Providence cousins, and we saw them. This is by the time we were here after 1924. But we didn't mix an awful lot with the city.
Did you visit other parts of the city? Do you remember when you were, or did you pretty much stay on the point and go to Jamestown?
Well, we went to Second Beach. We went a lot there. Yeah. We went to the Redwood Library. We did the marketing. All of us girls did the marketing.
Now, where were the markets?
We went to Eddie's Market down on Thames Street. And, of course, we bought fish. We went to the fish market. There was a fish market called Smith's Fish Market. And I had a boyfriend. He was a tutor on the Avenue. And he used to call up on the telephone and he'd say, "Is this Smith's Fish Market?" Because, see, I was called Fisher. So he said,
you were talking about
my younger brother and sister. I thought of course, you see, we had quite a conglomeration of people who came to see us. It's because we were this bunch of joyful, cheerful girls. That's why it was. But my brother Bill began to get more into Newport. My brother Bill and my sister Debbie really did mix with a nice, very nice bunch of people who swam out of Third Beach. And my brother Bill knew the 2 Drury girls, and Miss Davenport's nephew. There were a whole group of them over there at Third Beach. Some of the fathers worked at St. George's School, and so they did mix much more with the Newport community than we did. And in a big family like that, there usually is a division in the family. The older group is separate from the younger group. So Debbie and my brother Bill knew many more of the people there, over in that area. They knew a whole bunch that we didn't know. We were older, but we had a lot of people coming to see us. I think it's really because we were such a lot of fun.
Well, it sounds like you had a lot of fun.
Always silly. We used to walk on the pier. Now, my pier has a railing all around the outside of it. It isn't any railings any bigger than that. And we girls used to walk right along the railing, right straight out around the edge and back. We did it all the time. We were wild, but amusing wild. Not anything mean or like that.
So one of the things we were talking about was this neighborhood. So has this street pretty much stayed? The neighborhood has changed.
Well, the street has changed, although of course it's gotten better. But when the Restoration movement began, you see, this has made a tremendous change because of the old houses on the point, not Washington Street, which were restored. And then in consequence, people with nice, neat little 19th century houses repainted theirs. And a different class of people moved in, or the people who lived were able to pull themselves up a little. This all goes along with Newport getting more, flourishing more too, you have to realize. It comes in 2 directions. Newport began to get better off after World War II. You see, we've jumped awfully far.
Yeah, right.
But that's when the change came. Previously to that, the point, Washington Street stayed the same. Now, in World War I, for instance, they had these enormous cannon buoys. And I can't tell you how big they actually were, but I would think they were as round. The diameter would be from this rug over to the wall.
So how
huge.
Far is that?
Wow, is it 10 feet?
Yeah, at least.
And to these great cannon buoys would be fastened 3 or 4 destroyers. and they were right off Washington Street. They were right off there, these clusters. And of course the activity during the war was enormous. There were little tiny ferry boats that went from the torpedo station to the Navy base. There was one little ferry boat, I don't believe it was any bigger than this room, it was the cutest little thing you ever saw. They ran back and forth, and then there were the gigs which took the sailors back to the destroyers, and they had to be there at a certain hour, 7 probably. And these gigs would be absolutely crammed full of sailors, just crammed full. You wouldn't see how they'd get another one in, and the boat would be way down in the water. And of course, at one time in the winter time, in the late fall, when we had one of those November storms, they were running one of these gigs out, and the boat tipped over, and several boys were drowned.
Oh my gosh.
Drowned with it. Yes, it was. They took too many on, because they were going to be late if they didn't get on soon. And the town, of course, was filled with sailors, with white hats, walking up and down by the street, and it was very.
So
different.
the flavor, you're saying the flavor was very
entirely
different. Yeah.
And on account of the Navy base up there, the hospital, they did walk this street. The boys would come walk to town from the hospital, so it made the street carried traffic of that sort. But the bay itself was just alive with traffic. This is World War I. I'm not talking about World War II, because they were quite different as far as the bay was concerned.
So, and then before the restoration, you mentioned that a lot of the houses were rooming houses, or?
Well, I don't think so many rooming houses. There were cold water flats.
The cold water.
They were divided up into cold water flats. And then there were the little ones, that little pitched roof, 2-story, story and a half, I guess it's called. There were a lot of those built. But it was very poor. You see, the steamship company had been one of the few.
Well, they had all their repair shops down.
Yes,
there?
they had shops there, but you have to realize Newport had nothing to go on. It had no. I don't mean the word manufacture. What do I mean?
Industry.
Industry. It had no industry. It had the fishing industry. It had the summer colony. And it had the Fall River boat. And that was about all. It didn't have anything else. It was a very, very poor town. When John and I got married, you wouldn't believe how poor this town was. The average income for the state of Rhode Island was $4,000 a year or less. Average income. This is one reason why it takes so long for Rhode Island to catch up. And yet there are a lot of people who move into Rhode Island that are angry because Rhode Island is so far behind. But it had so much farther to go. And actually, I think Newporters should feel very proud of the fact that they're able to sustain life on a lower level than a lot of other great cities in this country who have to have so much to live on. We're used to getting along on less. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, sure it does.
So it was very poor. The houses on the avenue were closed up all winter long. All it had to have was a caretaker living in it, and nobody vandalized them. People sometimes walked through the gardens, but there wasn't this enormous amount of vandalism. And the caretaker could do the job. And then, of course, they all lived off a lot of them lived off what the summer residents needed in the summer. Painting, they did a lot of painting and cleaning, a lot of cleaning. And cleaning the houses. And of course, this is all before World War II.
So have you noticed a difference in terms of people living here year-round now? Yes. Are there a lot more?
Tremendous change. Tremendous change in Newport. But this is after World War II.
Yeah.
Do you want me to jump after there now? To World War II?
Whatever.
You should direct me. You can see I can go in any direction. It changed a lot, but it had a flavor of its own in World War I, there's no doubt about it.
I think what I'd like to do is cover some questions about your children.
All right. Okay.
Your children were all born in Newport. Were they
Yes.
born in the hospital, or were you?
Yes, they're all native Newporters, all born in the Newport Hospital.
Did you have any help with raising the children?
My mother when I had my first child, my mother gave me a nurse for 2 weeks after I got out of the hospital. No, I guess it was 1 week. But I didn't have a nurse for any of the others. But she did, for 2 of them, she gave me enough cash to have some help in the house for 2 or 3 months. And it was very nice to have them. I had my 3 sons, each weighed 9.5 pounds.
Oh my God.
So, well, my husband was 6'4". And so, I did need help. But of course the third one was born in the middle of World War II, and I hadn't any help for him at all. I don't know how I survived that. And he wasn't quite as big as the others. He was only 9.9 pounds, 5 ounces.
What was it like for the children that they grew up in this house?
It was wonderful for them. Of course the house was cold. The wind went through this house. But they, very soon, you know, after they got 8, 9, they didn't get that many colds. Not more than anybody else. But they had a wonderful time. They just lived on the shore. And in the springtime, they'd set a sail off the back end of the house. They'd tie it onto the roof of the porch. And when the wind would come round, they'd go out there and move it so that it got the wind in the other way. And they were always mooring rowboats off the porch in the wintertime. And I can see the rowboat now. They'd get the painter to just drop exactly the way it would if the boat were moored off the water, you know. And of course, they all rowed a lot and swam a lot. And 2 of them fell off the pier when they were little. I can remember when my son John fell off the pier. There was a board missing in the pier. And it was March. And I just realized I had another baby on the way. And my son John went out in the pier and he slipped down in the hole. He had his overcoat on. Fortunately, the tide wasn't high. It came up to his neck. And he began walking himself through the water to the shore, screaming at the top of his lungs.
Now, how old was he at the time?
He was 4. And Tom, who was 7, came rushing in to tell me. And I was doing the wash. And I had the feeling that I went out the back door and I just sailed over the whole yard and landed in the porch. I landed in the pier. But by the time I got there, he was up in the shore, perfectly safe. But boy, was he yelling.
Now, were there many children on the street that they...
No, but they went to school with all the kids here. So they didn't have any trouble. They went to the public schools, and so they knew all the kids. And they played in the shore together. They had plenty of friends. So that was no problem. But they did lead a rugged life, I'm telling you.
An active life.
An active life.
Yeah.
And when they were difficult in the wintertime, got to fighting, which, you know, boys do, brothers do, I'd bundle them all up and we'd go walk somewhere around the cliffs or the shore. Sometimes we'd go around the cliff walk. Sometimes we'd start at, we'd go around by Castle Hill. We just walk. Sometimes we'd go through, we'd walk the shores of this island. And they loved it, and so did I. And after World War II, we found so much on the beaches. And in World War II, they'd find face masks which had fallen off the boats, and they'd find that lovely dark blue sailor's jersey, you know. They all had them. I'd bring them home and wash them. And they'd find coats and K-rations and, you know, every sort of thing.
That's real beachcombing, isn't it?
I can remember one time we got a great big canister, khaki colored, of course, and we couldn't figure out what was in it. We took it home and it was lemon jello. Wasn't that funny? So they really had a lot of fun, and I picked up firewood. I've been terrible. I always pick up firewood. But we really enjoy that. And my boys to this day, they don't like anything better than walking on a shore somewhere. They just love it.
What other kinds of games did they play here in the neighborhood?
I don't know, because when my boys went out to play with other boys, I didn't pay any attention to them. I don't think I was a difficult mother in that direction. Of course, there were some boys I didn't like as much as other boys, but I didn't kibitz on them. But however, there's no question, the children and the Point children did not come to this house very much. My husband was a very tall, impressive human being. And also, you have to realize that he had a very bad heart condition. And all his life, I did a great deal in the way of protecting him from irritation, and also to make it so that when he came home, things were quiet and peaceful for him. I knew he had a bad heart when I married him, but I didn't realize till about 1944 how bad it was. He'd had rheumatic fever and had 2 damaged heart valves. And so keeping the house quiet and the boys quiet was a very important part of my job. And also he was a very creative man, filled with tremendous creative power. And I know when I married him, I thought to myself, if I can only allow this man to express himself creatively, I will think I've done a good job. And I tried so hard to make it so that he could not be restricted in this. What a thing to say in front of Women's Lib. Women's Lib wouldn't have anything to do with that, would they?
I don't know.
He was a wonderful man. Such fun, so humorous, and so full of interest that my life was just enriched in every way by him. So you see, there was a bargain. And what's wrong with making a bargain? I got everything from it. I think that he and I did a lot for each other. I always think that.
Now, did he do things with the boys, or was his physical activity limited?
No, he did it when he got older, when they got older. He really didn't care too much about little children. He'd pick them up and love them, you know, and throw them in the air, but he didn't do much with them. I can remember when Tom was a year old, Tom put his finger in the washing machine and cut the end off, and we had to take him to the hospital. He was just about 1 year old, and he had a big operation on it, and my husband and I made a dictionary of all of the words Tom could say. But fortunately, we didn't take it to the hospital, to the nurses. Imagine what the nurses would have said. But you see, he was interested in how much this little boy, this little creature could say, only a year old.
Yeah.
And so he was somewhat interested in it.
Now, were the boys involved at all with your husband's shop at all?
Well, not yet. No, not yet. Tom was a very hyperactive boy. I'm sure he was like his father, and I was hyperactive too. But he irritated my husband. He knocked things over, and he jumped around, and you know, he full of life and always wanted to be rushing around it. And this irritated my husband. But the second boy was a wonderful little creature who just sat in my husband's lap and sucked his thumb. And of course, he's the one that went into the shop when he was 15 and learned how to cut letters. And he's the one that runs the shop now. And he used to go with my husband to set stones. Tom went with him too. They'd go in the truck to set a gravestone.
Yeah.
And he took both of them to set stones. That was something. I even went to set stones with him sometimes, so that I learned how to mix cement nicely.
Now, which son lives in the house with you now?
Tom, the oldest.
The oldest one,
yes.
Okay. And does he work here in Newport?
Tom is running the Museum of Yachting at Fort Adams with Andy Kennedy.
Oh, okay.
So he does that.
And then,
the youngest one is Richard.
Okay.
And Richard is a photographer, and he's an associate professor of photography at Yale University.
Oh.
And he drives down to New Haven a couple of days a week. And then he has his own photography shop in which he does a lot. Photography work for books, for making books, that go into books. And he's very busy. And he looks more like my husband than the other ones do. Although he's not so tall. Only one of my sons is tall like their father.
Now, do you have any granddaughters? Or are they all? The boys seem to run heavily in the generation after you.
I've got 6 grandsons and 2 granddaughters.
Oh.
Well, the Benson family didn't have a girl for 4 generations. They didn't have one.
Huh.
And it isn't until my son Richard had a daughter that we broke the mold and had a granddaughter. So that was wonderful, wasn't it? So I have all those grandsons now.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But the Benson family had gotten down to just one person, my husband, and I can't tell you how many side Bensons there were, and nobody had any descendants. My husband was the last one.
Did he have any brothers or sisters?
He had a twin who died when he was 3 1/2 of diphtheria. That's all he had. So we rejuvenated the Benson family. No doubt about that. I don't know how well, but we did it.
Well, it sounds like they're all overachievers to me. They've all done very, very well.
Oh, well, they're all. I sometimes think to myself that they go back to so many New England ancestors that it's no wonder they're all a little cracked. They go back to too many New Englanders. That's what they do. Too many early settlers.
In terms of this neighborhood, could you tell me what it is that you like most about the neighborhood?
Of course, I've been here so long that I just know everybody along the street, and I'm so fond of them. awfully fond of them all. They've been here for years. Gladys MacLeod, who died last year, she's been here as long as I have. And that's true of all. Now there are a lot of new people that have come in the Point, and I have a hard time meeting them and knowing them. I meet them in the Point Association, and that's very good. But the ones close to you are the ones you know. I mean, there's a retired Navy officer across the street I'm very fond of, that couple. And then up in the Coble house now is the granddaughter, the niece of King Coble, and she comes in the summer, so I know her. And the MacLeod descendants in the MacLeod house. You know, it runs right up the street. I know them all now. I'm very comfortable here. But because I know them all, Bill Fullerton down here, I know almost everybody.
Are there any disadvantages to this area?
There's one, and it's terrible.
Is the north
wind? The wind.
Yeah.
The south wind or the north wind.
Yeah.
Either one, they're perfectly terrible. And the cold, the oil bill, those are the disadvantages. So you have to pay for it.
Now, what about your friends? Are they all over Newport, or are they primarily in this area?
You see, I didn't have that many friends when J.H. Benson was alive. We had several couples we were devoted to. Francis and Sue Brady, who taught at the Abbey School. It was the Portsmouth Priory. He was the associate headmaster of the Priory School, and he was one of my husband's very best friends. And we saw them a lot, and they had 6 children, and we were awfully close to them. We knew Eric Taylor. My husband grew up with Eric Taylor, and of course there were all the people in Newport that he'd gone to school with. They all knew him, and so but he was very different from the people he grew up with. I mean, he grew up with ordinary Newporters, and here he was, this crazy artist. He wanted to be an artist. And he had an uncle who thought that was, a Benson uncle who thought that was perfectly insane to be an artist. And he paid for my husband to go to the Severn Prep School for Annapolis. He paid the fee for him to go, and my husband passed the top math exam. But when he was examined for Annapolis, his heart was already in trouble, and he couldn't go. So then they said, all right, be an artist. And that's when he went to art school in New York. And that's how he got started on doing what he wanted. But getting into the gravestone business was just a fluke. It was just by chance. I think sometimes all of the people who think everything's ordained, you know, there are lots of people who think things are ordained, but chance operates in our lives in the most enormous way.
And for the most important things, like who you marry and where you live and where you go. Yeah, that's right. So how did this happen?
Well, in the summer, his grandmother, Anthelia T.E.W. Howard, used to take him to the old burying ground on Memorial Day, on Decoration Day it was called, to put lilacs and snowballs on the family graves. So as a youngster, he had wandered in the graveyards and seen the old gravestones. And quite early on, I think those days when he was working in the summer in the Art Association in his late teens and early 20s, he wrote several articles about old gravestones for the Newport Daily News or for the Newport Herald. And I have some of those. And also, after the year he was in Greece and saw so many Greek gravestones, he began to really study them. And then he went into the old stone-cutting shop on Thames Street, which still existed, although it no longer had a Stevens in it. It had the Stevens brother-in-law. But there was an old stone cutter there. And John went there and used to like to go there and talk to this man. And somewhere in there, about 1926 or 27, the wife of the Reverend Stanley Hughes, who was the clergyman at Trinity Church, the wife died. And the clergyman came up to my husband and said, I want you to make a gravestone for my wife that can go into Trinity Church graveyard. And of course it's filled with beautiful old slate stones. So from that he started. You can imagine how much he had to learn. He had to learn where to buy stone, how to surface it, how to cut it into shapes, what kind of chisels he needed to cut it. He had everything to learn. The thing he did know was lettering. He loved lettering, and he'd always done lettering, and he'd studied letters on the stones. He during his lifetime he changed his handwriting about 4 times. Totally different. But his early interest in lettering was very, very real. And this is how he got started in the gravestone business. And he rented the shop that summer. The next year he bought it for $1,200. And in order to
Now,
buy it
this
for
was when, about
1927.
1927.
In order to do it, he had to take a note at the bank and put a mortgage on his mother's house to raise $1,200. But he did do it, and then he got several people helping him. And those years, I know they were rugged, but you see, they were the years when we'd come in and take him over to Second Beach at the end of the afternoon for a good change. So that was very exciting, but it was awfully hard work. And in the 1930, he got a job at the Rhode Island School of Design to teach lettering.
Mm-hmm.
And that was wonderful because that gave him 2 or 3 days of work a week for which he got paid regularly. And you know the difference between this work where you're paid after the job's done. So that really set him on his feet. And lettering was required to all freshmen, and that was very important. So it was a good place to be. But still, he had quite interesting time in the John Stevens shop. He had one fellow that worked with him. He was good too, good letter cutter. But this guy, the summer John went to on one of those Olympic tours. When he came back, the man had gotten a sandblast machine in the shop and was sandblasting stone. See, my husband did it all. We do it all by hand. We don't have any machinery except a saw. Just so. That's my husband now.
Right?
Maybe, yeah, we'll just finish. We better just finish up now.
We'll just finish up this part of the tape, which
All
I don't
right.
think will.
All right, take long.
Unless you want to stop now, because I can just
won't
leave.
take long, will it?
No, no.
Can you talk to me?
Yeah. What was I saying?
I could go back and listen.
No, wait a minute. No, thank
You were talking about your husband's shop, and everything was done by hand, and
Yes,
and
sandblasting. So he was very upset to come home and find this fellow had misunderstood so much what he was trying to do in the shop, making beautiful gravestones.
Mm.
So
yeah, and you said he worked 2 days a week up at the
up at the
RISD,
School
so
of
he
Design,
had
yeah. So
he
he
had
got enough
set salary at least
Yeah,
for 2
and it
days.
helped him along.
You know.
So that really did make a difference to his life. And then, of course, when we got married, he was still doing that. Still going up to the School of Design. In fact, he taught at the School of Design as long as he lived.
Did he?
Yes. He first did all the lettering, and then he did organize the sculpture department and got that going. And then when his heart got so very bad, he just went up for one lecture a week. And that was what
Now, was
did.
he very sick before he died?
No, he wasn't. No, well, for 2 years he was. For 1 year, he really couldn't do very much. Your heart gets enlarged when you have that, and he had what's called tachycardia, rapid heartbeat.
Yes.
And he'd suddenly get a spell of this rapid heartbeat, and it was perfectly ghastly, you know. So that's what happened to him. But of course, there was no end for him there. There wasn't anything you could do for him then.
Yeah.
And also, by the time you've had a heart condition like that for so many years, your heart is so badly enlarged.
So was it very hard for him and for you?
I think it was very hard for
Yeah.
him. He stayed in bed for breakfast and came downstairs, and if he felt well enough, I'd take him up to the shop for an hour or two. The fall before he died, I did go into the shop and I learned how to do the books, how to carry on all the financial part of the shop, which was a help. And by that time, you see, my youngest son, John, was cutting stone after school for pocket money. He was roughing out the letters. But when he died in February, I had no idea of running the shop. No idea at all. He hadn't talked about it to me. He'd said a couple of things, which I realized later showed that he had considered my running it, but he didn't talk to me. He said, James Casey will help you with the lettering. That's the name of it. A man in Newport who had worked at the Stevens shop said, James Casey will help you with the lettering. That's all, nothing else. And then sometime, I don't know, weeks later, he said, and Addie DeBaytoon will help you with the ornament, designing the ornament. And that's all. I had no idea of running the shop.
Now, how old were your kids at the time he died?
Tom was in the Navy. Tom was 18, he was in the Navy. John was at high school, and Richard was 13.
So that was a big load
It
for
was a
you.
lot. Yes, it was a lot.
Yeah.
But still,
So then you ran the shop for 17,
for 17
years.
yeah.
And then, was it Richard who came in?
John,
John,
the middle
the
one.
middle
John,
one.
the middle
who has the shop now.
Who has the shop now. I realized that my husband didn't leave me anything in cash at all, nothing. He left me a way for my life to be happy if I had enough guts to do it. Because of course it was wonderful to run that shop. It's perfectly wonderful. Wonderful experience. The whole thing was just marvelous. He was right there with me because it was his shop. We were doing the same kind of things that he did. And so it really was, couldn't have been a better solution to my life than that. After losing him, I couldn't have had anything better than that. My son John went up to the School of Design quite soon. So he was away. And Richard and I were here alone in the house for quite a while. So.
You mentioned that you're an officer in the Newport Historical Society. Are there other organizations in which you're involved in?
Yes, I'm a trustee of the Redwood Library.
Oh.
I'm a trustee of the New School. But that's all.
When you say the New School?
The New School is a little private school, an independent school in the island here. It's a very, very nice one.
Oh.
All my grandchildren have been there. There still are 2 there.
Oh.
They've all been to that school.
Now, what about the art museum? Do you have any association?
No, I don't. But that's just because the others got me first.
Yeah.
And I don't think you should be on too many boards. You don't do a good job if you're on too many boards. They tend in Newport, to have the same bunch of people on all the boards. Doesn't make sense.
I'd like to. I think there's only about another minute left on this tape. But one of the maybe you could say something more. I'm interested about this neighborhood and how you perceive it as being different from the other neighborhoods of Newport. One of the things that seems to come out is that there really are just very distinct neighborhoods.
We certainly all know each other on this street, and we're very friendly with each other. We're fond of each other on this street because we've all been here so long together. And I don't know how else to put it. There aren't strangers here. Well, do you
think that's different from other neighborhoods?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I have no idea. I guess this comes when you've lived in a place for a long time. Don't you think it does? You either never liked any of the people around you, or you like them.
Yeah.
New people do come in. Now there's a house down the street that's been all redone over a White House, and I don't know who's in it now. I suppose I'll get.
At the home of Esther Fisher Benson, and we're on our second phase of our interview on Monday, April 22nd, and we're at her home again.
23rd.
Today's the 20th. That's right. Thank you. The 23rd. And what we thought we would do would be to straighten out a few questions that I had after listening to the tape about the family members, and then going into the major events of Newport, which is the second part of the interview. So I think I'm clear about you and your husband and your 3 children and your brothers and sisters. I have that all down here. Your mother's maiden name was Atwater.
Yes.
And her first name?
Dorothea.
Dorothea, okay. Now, your grandparents are Benjamin R. Smith, who married Esther Fisher Wharton?
Yes, that's
okay.
right.
Now, I did look at that book that your brother wrote on the working schooner.
Did you?
Which was delightful.
It's a nice book.
But one of the things that I read in the preface that it just was so sad was about Benjamin's brother. And
Edward's brother, whose name was William Horton. My father was Edward Wanton.
Right. Edward's brother. First there was Anna Wharton. That was one of the children.
Anna Wharton, William Horton, Esther Morton Smith, and my father, much younger, Edward Wanton Smith.
All right. Anna Wharton, William
Wharton.
See,
these are all Smiths.
Smith, right.
Esther Morton Smith.
Yes, I have her down.
And Edward Wanton Smith, my father.
He was the youngest.
He was much younger
And
than
he
the
was
others.
born in 1875.
1875.
Okay. Now, Anna Wharton married Dr. Henry Austin Wood.
Yes.
And their descendants are now next door at 64
Right.
Washington
Right.
Street.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned Esther Morris.
No. Esther Morton.
Esther Morton, okay.
See, she's the second one.
She's the, oh, okay. She's the
Or
second.
is she the third one? Oh, wait a minute. Get back to my father's family.
Okay. Benjamin
Anna,
R. Smith.
Yes, you've got Anna Horton, William Horton, Esther Morton.
Esther
That's right.
Morton. Okay.
Morton Smith.
Now you had mentioned her as being at that doing something in the school in Philadelphia. Was that the same
because
one?
she lived in Waltham. Now let's see, how are we mixed up here?
I thought Anna lived in Waltham.
Well, see, oh yes, you're right. I'm a whole generation off. Yes, my aunt Esther Morton Smith did live in Philadelphia, and she didn't do anything with the school, but she went to meeting there. She spoke in meeting. That's what we were thinking about.
Yes, right.
And she was one of the people who was sent down to Washington when Herbert Hoover became president, because they put a Quaker meeting in Washington so that President Hoover could go to Quaker meeting. And my aunt went down there most of the time when he was the president.
Isn't that something? Now, she died in 1941.
She died in 1941, yes.
Yes, that was when you had that series of tragedies in the family.
That's right.
All right. And then William Wharton Smith was the one who tragically drowned.
He was drowned when he was still in law school at the University of Pennsylvania. He'd gone to Harvard, and then he went to law school in Philadelphia.
Well, it said in the preface of the book how this was just dominated your father's life in terms of this this
terrible
tragedy.
Accident. Well, my father was only 14, and it had a terrible effect on him. It was they went out on the 4th of July in a great big catboat, which was owned by my uncle, called the Falcon.
Right.
And there was a heavy southwest wind, and as young men will do, they were determined not to reef the sail. And they went through the reef. You know, our Brenton's Reef has two passages, an outer passage and an inner passage. And so they were going through it just for the heck of it, I suppose you might say. And somehow or other the main sheet got tangled. And in a catboat, as you know, the mast is way, way forward. So there's a tremendous heaviness to the bow of the boat. And she ran herself right under. And my uncle had a friend with him who had his leg in a plaster cast.
Oh my God.
I don't know how my father managed to get a hold of this racing bowsprit, but there was a racing bowsprit always tied on the side of the Falcon, and he must have known they were getting in trouble. We don't know about that.
Yeah.
But he came ashore clinging on to this great piece of wood, which I have in the other room, and the other two were drowned. We think sometimes that perhaps my uncle tried to help the one with the cast.
Yeah.
So it was really a terrible thing. And it was an awfully windy day, and the story is that my grandmother in the house next door was very nervous that day. She kept looking out the back windows and looking around. And one time she looked out the front window, and there down at the end of Washington Street, where Long Wharf comes in, there was a little cart, a seaweed cart. Men used to go out and collect seaweed and sell it to people with great gardens, with a little man driving it with a horse. And they came up to the house, and my father was lying on the seaweed in the back. He was all right, but he was this fellow who gathered seaweed had found him lying on the shore out there.
Yes.
Off Brenton's Reef. And it had a terrible effect on my father. See, he was only 14. And he'd been
but
very
it didn't
close
seem to
this older
curtail
brother.
his interest in sailing?
No, but it made him very cautious. And of course we were all taught to be very careful in boats. Always taught that. And we never tipped boats over. Now, you know, people don't think anything about tipping a boat over now. Of course they have air flotation tanks in them. But if we had ever tipped in a boat, I don't think my father would have let us go out in one again. He felt so severe. You don't tip over boats. You don't do it. Of course, we didn't go out when it was bad.
Yeah,
we reefed. I mean, that's not talking about going on a great cruise when something happens that you can't help. But he was very cautious in the boat. So.
I looked at the photographs also which your father had taken, and I thought they were just magnificent. And the fact that your sister Sally had
she kept them,
wouldn't throw them away, even though your brother had indicated they probably had no value.
And then, of course, it was my brother who pulled them all together and got the prints and wrote the book.
Yes.
So.
Do you remember your father taking pictures after this?
No, because this is before he was
period?
married. No, he didn't take any afterwards. He did have quite a nice camera.
Was he the kind of person who had sort of consuming interests, and
well,
once that was done, he put it aside?
No, he wasn't one of those. But for some reason, he didn't go on taking photographs. Of course, it's partly because those schooners weren't coming in the bay anymore. And I think his photography was related to the subject matter. See, it was his interest in sailboats and schooners and old boats that was the main thing in that photography thing. And he really didn't take an awful lot of them later. He took a few of us when we were children, but not too many.
Yeah.
So I think you might say the interest in photography was not the main one. He made his own camera.
Yeah.
You know that.
Oh, really?
Yes, he did. He made a view camera with the bellows. So that he took his own pictures with that. I think we still have it somewhere. So it's not surprising that one of my boys is a photographer.
Yeah.
And my husband's
someone
father
in
was a
yachting and
photographer,
someone
too.
in the stone business.
Yeah.
So they've all pursued one of the interests.
My husband's father was a photographer
Oh,
too.
was he?
Yes. He took very nice photographs, but only for personal reasons. He wasn't at all professional. And though his glass negatives are all up at the Providence Public Library.
Oh.
They've made a collection of negatives of Rhode Island.
Yeah.
So I gave them to the Providence Public Library.
Yeah. In terms of your husband's family, were they many generations in Newport, or?
Well, my mother-in-law comes from Rhode Island, way, way, way back. She's came so far back. I mean, I was counting up this morning for another purpose, and there were 10 generations behind her in one line. And you know, it's only, well, of course, I suppose 250 years.
Yeah.
But still, that's a lot.
It sure is.
And every single line of her family her side of the family was Rhode Island. Just as Rhode Island. She went back to the grandfather of Oliver Hazard Perry and all those Perrys over in South Carolina. And I couldn't name all of the ones she went back to, but my husband's father's family came from Connecticut, and we've never been able to pin them to any other Benson family. There were other Bensons in Rhode Island, but we've never been able to pin John's family down. We have the Connecticut connection, but there's lost some of it in there. His family must have come to Newport in the time of his great-grandfather, who was a ship captain. His great-grandfather was John Andrew Benson, and he, as I said, was a ship captain, and he married in Stockholm. The person he married was named Catherine Holmes. But you see, she's not Swedish.
Oh.
And we always were trying to figure, how did Catherine Holmes get to Stockholm? We've never found out. But my husband used to love to kid people and say, oh, yes, he had Scandinavian ancestors. Because, he was this great, tall thing with a beard. He was always kidding. And then the next generation was Bernard John Benson, who was a chief engineer on the steamer Providence, the Fall River Line Providence. And he was called the kid glove engineer because he was always so tidy and precise and neat down there in the engine room. And that was my husband's grandfather. But after that, then my husband had an uncle who was, I haven't the right title, superintendent of the Marine Department at the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railway.
Oh.
And so he lived in New York, and this was all to do with the Fall River boats, and later to do with all sorts of traffic in there.
Now, was he the uncle who had your husband go to that
yes.
school?
He was
Okay.
that uncle. That's
All
just
right.
the uncle. He was. My husband's father died in 1933, a year before we were married.
Oh.
And he really never fulfilled his potential. My husband's father didn't. He was a very bright man. But he stayed in Newport, and didn't really do very much for himself. He worked in one of the big stores, but he didn't do anything especially interesting. Of course, that was a time when there wasn't much you could do in Newport. Newport was right on its back. There were no manufactories, no enterprises in Newport. There was fishing, and there was the Fall River line, and there was the summer colony, and that was it.
Yeah.
And if you didn't fit into any of those, you had a hard time getting work. And of course, Newport lost a lot of young people in that period. See, that my father-in-law was born in, I guess, 1878, 77 or 78. So he would have been, around 30 in 1910, and he didn't have any decent job at all. His wife, my mother-in-law, didn't want to leave Newport. Didn't want to leave it at all. In fact, said she wouldn't. So he had to find something to do, and there really wasn't anything. I only met him once, so I didn't know him at all well. I haven't any recollections of him. But you do have to realize that Newport was so down and out. And when we married, it was just like a ghost town in the wintertime. It was very small and very little happened in the wintertime. I told you the other time I used to take the boys wandering around.
That's right, yeah.
In the places around the avenue. So it was down and out.
Okay, so that's one set of
Relations.
grandparents.
Yeah.
Now, your great-grandparents, was it, by any chance, was it Deborah Fisher?
Deborah Fisher
Who married?
William Horton. And I
Okay.
can't give you the date on that.
Now, that's
so
all right.
far back.
Now,
But you see,
they
that's
had
the, yeah.
their children, was this right? I tried
Yeah.
I constructed this, I don't know if it's right. Esther Fisher Wharton?
Yes, she was the youngest.
And was Joseph Wharton? And
Joseph
William Wharton?
And William Horton.
Oh,
They
great.
got them all right. And of course, they're all the Hortons in Jamestown.
Now, was that the three of, were there just
There
three?
were 9 of them.
Well, I thought, I have 9 written down
Oh,
somewhere.
yes, there are 9 of them.
Oh, dear.
So that was another tremendous family, and they,
And
the
it was
Lippincott's and
Deborah Fisher Wharton
the O'Neills and the Lippincott's are all,
who came up here
to stay
when your
with-
mother was here. When your
No,
mother
my
was
grandmother.
when
She
your
came
grandmother was
to-
here.
This is before my time.
Yeah.
Stayed in the house next door, 64 Washington
Yeah.
Street. Came to stay with her daughter Esther Fisher Wharton
Right.
Smith.
Yes.
And the brothers came up and stayed in boarding houses around the neighborhood. And then that's when they went to Jamestown.
That's
and
when they went to
bought all
Jamestown.
that beautiful land.
Okay, all 9 of them.
No, not all 9.
No, but they had
Yes.
9 children. So okay. Now, your other great grandparents was an Atwater. There would have been an
Yes,
Atwater who
yes.
married,
My grandfather, Atwater, was named Richard Meade Atwater.
and was he the one who went to Berlin
Yes.
and Paris? And,
Yes,
okay.
that's the one. And he was also a chancellor of Brown University for quite a while.
Oh. And his wife.
His wife was Abby Sophia Green. And she's descended from the brother of General Nathaniel Green,
Oh.
from his brother Christopher Green. So there are Christophers all over my family.
As well as Esther's.
Yes,
A lot of
no,
Esthers.
I'm the last Esther.
Oh, okay.
I don't think anybody's ever wanted to have any more Esther. There were too many in all one patch.
Okay, now, Debbie Berry
Yes, Debbie
used
Berry.
to be Debbie Rossmassler.
Rossmassler.
And her mother, Marjorie,
Yes.
was
An
your
Atwater's
mother's
younger sister.
younger sister.
Right, you got it right.
Now, but how were there other children also?
And you don't want to get on the Atwaters.
Okay, all right.
There's so many of them, because see, there were 9 children there too.
Oh.
And they were a vast and very interesting clan. But although my grandmother Atwater came entirely from Providence, my grandmother Atwater did. She was a complete Rhode Islander.
Yes, you mentioned
My
that.
grandfather Atwater was not. He was from his life, but behind him were people from Connecticut and New York.
Okay. And he was in Syracuse for a while.
Yes,
right?
but of course he grew up in Providence and went to Brown University.
Oh, okay.
And the day he graduated from Brown University was the day the Civil War was declared. And all of his classmates, his graduating classmates, were all signing up to go to the Civil War. But of course he was a Quaker and he didn't go.
Oh.
So he taught school instead.
This is just the most wonderful way to learn history. It just is, and your family was certainly right in there. And the fact that you have all these names and dates and times, I just think is this something that your family talked about, in terms of?
They did. My mother was very genealogical minded, and she was always doing this, although I really shouldn't tell you a funny story, should I?
Why not?
My youngest sister, Mrs. Lutman in Jamestown, was engaged to a young man from Winchester, Massachusetts. And the young man and his mother came down to Philadelphia for Thanksgiving to meet the family. And this mother was a very strong, straight-looking person with marcelled white hair and a coat with a big fur collar, and she came in the front door and showed upstairs to her bedroom, and she came down practically at once with her family tree, which she presented to my mother to look at. And my mother was so staggered by this that she at once began to produce our family tree. And from that time on, she'd always been interested in genealogy, but nothing like what happened to her when this spur came in. And from that day on till the day she died, she pursued genealogy. She did my husband's genealogy, and she did the family. She was forever working at it. In fact, another story, which is just as good, my mother was always trying to get us on the Mayflower. She couldn't. She would try to get us on as if she was trying to get us to make a boat that was going to get to Europe, And my husband would kid her so about it. He teased her so. He was a great humorist that way. And then about 3 years ago, Mrs. Bowhouse at the Historical Society said to me, I think I've gotten John on the Mayflower. And I thought how my husband would have called up my mother and said, Ma, I'm on that boat and you're not. And how much she would have laughed.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
But she was interested in the people they were. It wasn't just putting names in the slots. It was all of these people and what they did. And I think it does make a difference.
See, this is what I did.
Yeah, well, that's good. You've got it right.
Well, but I've got it all in there, at least back several generations. But I don't know if it's just me, but this is the way I think. And if I can't put them in the right slot, then I feel awkward.
Lost.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a map, and
it's like the floor plan of the house.
Right. Mm-hmm. Exactly. Okay, well, I think that's great.
Did that get us caught up?
I think so. So, if you're ready, we'll. Our first subject is World War I.
Yes, but I did remember some of that, didn't I?
Well, you mentioned a little bit in terms of all of the boats that were out in front here during the war. Were you here? Let's see. You mentioned that it was either 1917 or 18 when you came up here because of the polio scare.
Yes.
But were you here in the summer of 1916?
We would have been there for the 2 weeks of my father's vacation.
Okay, and you would have been 8 years old, right?
Yes.
And you were in the house, staying in the house next door. Was this the time when there's a lot of traffic on Washington Street? Do you remember, or the years sort of blurred?
Traffic is so relative now.
Well, I mean, from the military.
Well, there were lots of sailors walking down the street because, of course, the Naval War College, where the Naval War College is now, they had the training school for sailors, so that they had drills once a week up there, and we used to go up and watch their drills. They were very handsome. The sailors all in their neat little white uniforms, and then the little what do you call that little circle leggings from here?
The leggings,
and they'd go through this wonderful drill, and there were a lot of sailors. So you see, they walked into town from the training station.
I've got some.
that was
I
very
collect
nice.
postcards of
Do
Newport,
you?
and I've got a lot of with the Navy from World War One, and
yes.
the beautiful sail. There was a sail training ship, I think that I've forgotten the name of it.
The Constellation.
The
was
Constellation.
There. She wasn't
is,
a sail training ship.
No.
She just lay there, and people could visit her. She was tied up there.
Was it like the Eagle now, sort of? In
Well,
terms
it's
of
like the
like
Constitution. It looked very much like
Yeah.
the Constitution. That was her sister's ship, which is in Boston. But she was there for quite a while, and then they sent her down to, I think she's in Baltimore. Anyway, the other thing which was such fun, all of these sailors had to learn to row one of those great, well, they call them whale boats that the Navy had.
Mhm.
It's like a over large rowboat. It's a great large rowboat, and they all had to learn to row them, and they'd have races up and down in front of the house. And that was lots of fun. They'd have a day when they had a tremendous big tournament. And you know, the oars were 10 feet long. Each sailor could only row one oar, so they'd be two on a seat.
Yeah.
But of course that boat was then kept on. It had such a wonderful shape, and we had an engine put in it later, and was used for a great many years. I think it wasn't until early in World War II that they stopped using it. But you still see them.
Yeah.
They're double enders. They're a very nice boat, but that's what the sailors used to learn to row in.
Some of the postcards that I have show these cannons being fired.
Well, that has to be part of some celebration of some sort. Well, of course, they fire a cannon whenever somebody important came in the harbor.
Mhm.
If an admiral came in on a ship, or if one particular great ship, they still do that. You'll hear the cannon being 21 gun salute, or I can't tell you what all the salutes mean. I used to know them.
And then with the drills, it would just be people. They were doing their marching.
Yes. Well, they present arms and
Uh-huh.
all of that kind of thing. It was very well disciplined and military looking.
Do you remember? Well, so when the war was declared,
I don't remember that. You have to realize,
you were
1914, I was 6,
right.
and I don't remember that.
But before the United States went into the war, there must have started to have been a build-up in terms of.
That's something that I wouldn't have known anything about.
No.
I did know something about it because some of my Atwater cousins, one of my Atwater cousins, at once went to war. He was only 16, and he went and signed a. How did he get in? He joined an ambulance service in France. So I did know something about it. And then you couldn't help but know the boys were signing up.
Mm-hmm.
And when somebody you knew was killed, my father would always tell us. My father used to read the newspaper in the morning at the dining room table at breakfast, and he would speak out the number of Americans killed that day that came out in the paper.
Mm-hmm.
It's as if he had to make some mention of these men who made such a sacrifice, and as if he also wanted us to realize what war was. So I remember that very clearly. But of course, by the time we got in, you see, then I'm getting near to 10,
Mm-hmm.
and I begin to have more awareness of what was happening. But you couldn't not be aware of it.
Sure.
Oh, no, you couldn't. And the food we had was very different. We couldn't get any white flour at all, you know. Not any. We had whole wheat flour, and for some reason, I don't understand it, we didn't make the bread very well, and it didn't stay together. It was always crumbling.
Mm.
I guess if we'd had a little white flour, it would have stayed together better. But I remember that bread because it had a wonderful taste. But it didn't rise very well, and it fell apart.
That's right, yeah. They mentioned that one of the questions here in the list is the clam bakes held for the sailors on Broadway. Is that something that
No,
you were
because you
aware
see,
of?
I wouldn't have been allowed to go to that. I
No.
was too young a child to go to something like that. My sisters and I didn't get into any of the social life which was put on for sailors. Not any. We were too protected from it down here living with our family. And we were still, then, you see, only up here for 2 weeks.
That's right.
In which time we just sailed, that's all. Sailed with my father in the catboat. That's all he wanted to do.
The torpedo station, do you
Yes,
remember
oh,
that
yes.
during
Yes.
World War I at all?
Oh,
or-
yes, because it was very busy. Certainly you couldn't fail to in all those ugly buildings over there.
Now, the the boats that went out, the ferry boats that went to Goat Island,
Yes.
that went from the
Went from
government
down-
landing.
Yes, right next to the old ferry dock.
Right, for the Jamestown ferry
Yes,
dock.
they went from there. So they were a little bit longer distance than during World War II when they just went from right down here on Washington Street.
Hmm.
So it was a longer passage. They were awfully neat little ferries. Of course, they were only people ferries, most
Yeah,
of them.
yeah.
They were awfully nice little boats. I remember them very well.
Is there anything else about Newport during World War I that you want to
I
mention?
can remember when the Fall River boat came in the harbor. At 3 o'clock in the morning,
Mm-hmm.
the boat would stop. See, they had a net out there with a gate in it. And the Fall River boat, don't ask me what a gate is in a net, because I can't tell you. But the Fall River line had to get through the place where she wouldn't be hit by mines. It was mined.
Oh,
It was all
okay.
mined out there. I think that's right. Anyway, I know there was a place we had to go in, so that the ship would stop. And when any ship, I guess, but when those great side wheelers stopped, this wonderful sound would stop. You know, the sound of the paddle
Yeah.
wheels, which isn't at all like a throbbing propeller. It's a great whooshing, very rhythmical whoosh, whoosh, like this. And so it would stop, and everybody would be aware that something was happening. And then she'd go a little while. I suppose she floated into the proper place and got through, and then she'd start up again. I remember that very clearly. So that was something. And then we also, all the times when we went down during the war, I can remember it was a little bit nerve-wracking. There was a tenseness that never was before.
Mm-hmm.
Although, of course, going down the Sound, presumably you were safe. But we did come out, you see, around Point Judah. And there was a whole area in there where you could have gotten into trouble.
Do you remember any activities of your parents during World War I in terms of the war effort, or
my parents came up here for 2 weeks for his vacation, and that's what they did. You know, in those days, a man worked so long. My father worked all week. He got to work at 8:30 in the morning. He got home at 6:30, 6 or 6:30, and he worked on Saturday mornings.
Mhm.
And he only had 2 weeks vacation. That's all he got, and that isn't much.
no, it isn't.
And so my mother was very anxious that the 2 weeks up here would be altogether for him. We were conscious of this too. We never went to the beach then. That's before our beach days. So it was a very concentrated 2 weeks, concentrating on sailing and that sort of thing. But
Okay.
we enjoyed it.
Maybe we can go on to the next section now, and that's the summer colony.
The summer colony.
The summer with the the mansions and Bellevue Avenue and
Well, my grandmother, Esther Fisher Wharton Smith, used to take us around the Ocean Drive in the surrey, which she would rent. And we'd go around in that. It was great fun.
now was
to
that
see.
rented on a daily basis?
No,
or-
no, she rented for a morning or for an afternoon.
Yeah.
I think this must have gone on ever since the earliest years of occupation of Newport, that you rented a cart, a wagon, or a
Of tape 2, and we're talking about the summer colony and going around on the
Ocean
on the
Drive.
Ocean Drive.
It was later on, after we lived here in 62 Washington Street, that we used to walk the Cliff Walk.
Oh,
And we had a wonderful time doing it. Except by that time, we were all teenagers. And we'd take our group of boyfriends and we'd all go out and walk the whole distance round and walk part of it back, you know. We loved it, and climbing the rocks. We were great rock climbers, all of us.
now that was when
That
the
family. This is
well, the
at
Chinese
1934.
tea
house
house,
was there,
and
yes.
that was right down
Yes, and
practically on
yes,
top
and
of the.
people had begun to vandalize it. It was too bad.
Oh, really?
Yes. They hadn't done it very much, though. The bad vandalism came later. But you went underneath it, you know.
Mhm.
And of course, we knew all of those houses on the avenue.
But you
Walking
mentioned while I was
through.
changing the tape that
Mhm.
there was no socializing with the people who stayed in these. Your family did not socialize with those
unless
people.
we met them at the art association.
Oh, okay.
We went to things at the art association. I told you that the art association. Oh my, that's a mouthful. The art museum had pageants in the summer.
Yes.
To help raise money for the funding of it.
Right.
And we were on several of those, and we would meet people who spread around a little bit more from in the Newport area. But we didn't have much to do with. Now I'll tell you another thing. I just remember this. Up from Annapolis would come a beautiful ship with a whole bunch of ensigns on it of the cadets at Annapolis, and all of the Newport mothers would get all excited and get entertainments planned so their daughters could meet these eligible young ensigns. And there was a lot of excitement when that happened, and that must have been after 1924.
I was rereading Bart Lippincot's book on Jamestown, and he mentioned the same thing with the young girls would be so excited when these cadets from Annapolis would come up.
And I don't remember ever going to one of those parties. Maybe I did, but I don't remember.
But during one person that I talked to for this oral history project mentioned that they were aware through the newspaper of some of the coming out parties and the elegant parties, and people would go and try and get close to the houses to see the people, but they certainly did not participate in any way.
We didn't do any of that. We were.
Was this something you were interested or?
No, I think we were interested in our own lives. We had busy, active lives. We had a whole bunch of nice boyfriends, and we were always doing something, you know, sailing or going to the beach. Or we did go to the art association, and we always were very active in the Old Port Day that I told you about.
Yes,
that we had here in the Point.
Yeah.
But still, you know, we.
What about when the summer colony, in quotes, started to decline, in quotes?
Well,
were you aware of this at all?
Well, of course, my husband and I were, but because it always seems to me as if two things. The Depression was the main one that caused the decline of the summer colony, and then the huge income taxes that were beginning to be implemented, and also there's one other one in there. You couldn't get servants anymore. You had to have this tremendous number of servants to staff a house, and so those three things together really were as much responsible of anything. And then I think also you'd have to say that some of the children of those proper Bellevue Avenue-ites, they were bored with it, a lot of them, and they wanted to do more interesting things. And some other, of course, it's all come back, but there was a while then where they were bored with just going to these great dinners and eating and all these parties and things. The younger generation fell off a good bit. You know, that's when people went to Southampton and what other great places were that they went to? Well, they did anyway.
Florida was coming in as a
Newport really did.
Europe?
But the Depression, yes, they did. They went to Europe a lot too. We took a summer tour of Europe, and Newport really was very depressed for a while in there. I mean, the summer colony really fell off, and people thought it was the end of the summer colony, but of course it wasn't at all.
Do you remember the houses being boarded up or being sold?
They were closed up, but they all had caretakers. Well, of course they were sold a lot, but you know, we're getting into a much later period now. We're getting into a lot of them were sold after World War II. They must have been closed up in World War II, a lot of them. You know, I don't think my information is accurate in here, but I think they were closed up. One or two were used for officers' quarters, not owned by the government, but run for officers' quarters. But there were a lot of them
you were
were
just
sold.
you were in a different world from the world that they were in, and as you said, you were busy and active.
We're not in our own life. We hadn't any desires to be on the avenue. We didn't have any of that Newport, that unfortunate Newport desire to be on the avenue. We didn't have that. There were lots of people in the city that were always trying to be included some way or the other, or trying to take part in it, and
so you
trying to
did
get
not, and
onto
you
it.
didn't participate on an
No.
economic level in terms of your
No.
family being working for any of these
No.
people, or
We were another kind of summer colonist, is what
Yeah.
we were. A totally another kind, and we just didn't relate to that one at all. Didn't bother us.
Oh. All right, so why don't we go on to the Fall
Yes.
River line,
All right.
about which you do have many
Memories.
associations and memories. You described how you would take the train from Philadelphia to New York.
Yes. Well, actually, we took the train from New Jersey. See, we'd been staying with the other grandmother,
Oh, okay.
the Atwater grandmother, and so we'd get all dressed up.
Now,
in
is that down on
That's
on
down
the,
it's farther down than Atlantic City. It's farther down than Ocean
Near Cape
City.
May,
It's
or?
right next to Cape May.
Okay.
It's in between Ocean City and
Wildwood?
Cape May.
Is that what? Or
No,
some-
Wildwood is there, but this is called Sea Isle City.
Oh, okay.
And we went there. My grandfather built a place down there way before the turn of the century, where he took his children.
Mm-hmm.
And then later in the early 1900s, he built a great big sort of a barracks, and his grandchildren, his children, married children, brought their children. And all the husbands came down over the weekends. But anyway, we'd get ourselves all dressed up and take the train from Sea Isle City to North Philadelphia. My father would meet us there, and we'd get on the train to New York. We'd go to New York, and then we'd walk across Front Street and get in the Fall River boat. And it always
Now,
looked
where
so
would the
good.
Fall River boat be
Well,
docked?
She was tied up down there on the river. I can't tell you which dock. Richard Berry can tell you
Yes,
which dock.
I'm sure he can.
She was.
But you walked from
we
the.
walked from where the train
Yeah.
stopped across. I think it was called Front Street, and that's where all those wonderful wagons with fruit were. There were wagons, carts all over with beautiful fruits, and my father would always buy these lovely fruits for us to eat in the boat. When we were very little, and I don't understand this, we used to have a picnic dinner for our supper, and we would take it out on the upper deck of the Commonwealth or the Priscilla, and with all of this fruit, we'd sit in those chairs and watch the boat going out of New York Harbor.
Now, what time would the boat leave?
She left about 6 o'clock.
And you would have a sleeping cabin that you.
Yes, we had a wonderful little cabin with 2 berths. They had two berths in them, and sometimes they'd be adjoining another one, and sometimes not. But of course, when you think of a family that in the end had 6 children, we did use quite a lot of berths.
Now, were the berths up
We'd
and
always
down
tried
or
to get-
side to side? Or?
Well, we'd always tried to get the rooms on the outside of the boat. So our
Uh-huh.
window, it was a window, it wasn't a porthole. We could open it and look right out, right down like that. It was very
Yeah.
exciting.
Now, who would you share the berth with?
Well,
you
we often they put 2 of us when we were little in one bed together, one berth together. But the boat looked so wonderfully cool and beautiful after the dirt and soot of the train. You know, those steam trains were marvelous, but they were awfully dirty. The soot from the chimney would come in the windows. There must be a backdraft there that pulls it in the windows. So when you took a long ride like that, you were conscious all the time of a little gritty feeling. And when we got to the boat here, it was all lovely and clean and windswept. And our little staterooms were all white, and they often had little cakes of soap wrapped up, and sometimes even a little tin of powder. And we just enjoyed it so much. We just felt perfectly at home there. When we got older, we went to dinner in the great dining room, and of course that was very exciting. But I think it was just because we were too much to put in the dining room when we were little.
So the ritual would be you would get on,
Yes.
and you would have your
Find
in
your
the
stateroom.
earlier days you would have your picnic.
Yes, up
Yes.
on the deck and eat all that wonderful fruit. And then there we'd sit. Now there was a time when we went through Hellgate Bridge. You know, later on they bombed some of the rocks. They dynamited some of the rocks out of Hellgate so it's safer. But when we were there, Hellgate had a very bad clump of rocks. And so once more the ship would slow up, and a whole bunch of the crew would come up to the bow. They roped it off, and they'd sit there ready to drop anchor if the current should begin taking the Commonwealth, the ship, toward the rocks. And then they'd get by a certain point, and then they'd start it up again, and we'd go through. Of course, it was very exciting going under the bridges, because you couldn't believe the masts would go under the bridges. We'd go under the Brooklyn Bridge, and I can't remember the name of the other. That was terribly exciting.
You see here, I pictured you being on the Hudson River, but these boats were docked.
They were going right on the Sound.
On the East River?
Were on the East River. They were getting right out on the Sound as fast as they could. And then when we got out by Rikers Island, which was the New York City dump, there'd be this terrible smell of burning dump smell. We all know it. And that was about the time when we used to be put to bed. Then we'd go and be taken to bed. We had to get ready for our 3 o'clock waking in the morning.
Right.
So, and my father, when he had 3 little girls, he'd always take us down to see the engine in the heart of the boat, and that was the most glorious experience. I've told you that my father had 3 little girls before he had a little boy. So we'd go down, and here down in that ship was this great crank. It was painted gray. No, red. It was painted red. And it was a huge thing. See, it turned the paddle wheels. And it went so slowly, and you could watch it going like this, turning those paddle wheels. And there were men at the sides, and each time the crank would come around, they'd squirt a little oil on a place. And then there were 2 things that went like this. They were painted yellow. I don't know what they were. But anyway, it was absolutely tremendous. And the engine room was so marvelous, a perfection of its kind. Everything all clean and spotless and oily, as if they knew they had to keep everything oily to keep the salt water out. But I just loved it. It was like a great heart in the middle of the ship, and pulling those great paddle wheels.
Was the Priscilla and the Commonwealth, were they alike?
They were the big ones.
Were they?
They weren't alike, really. They were alike in general, but not in particular, because the Priscilla was much more elaborate. She was very elaborate. She was beautifully done inside. The Commonwealth was a little simpler, but she was another great boat.
Well, how would you try and get on a particular boat? Was that, or
I think my parents took whichever one was coming in. See, one went up one night and came back the next, so they never went in the same one.
So the boat docked in Newport at 3 a.m.
It just tied up. It tied up and let people off, and then it went to Fall River.
Now, would it tie up to a dock?
Yes, down here where the shipyard is now. And this was quite a business.
This was at the end of Long Wharf?
Yes. Okay. It's where the shipyard is. They had a place where it tied up. And it used to come in. It always came in around the Goat Island, mostly came in around Goat Island in this way, because that was a better way to be able to get the ship in close to the dock.
That's at the north end of Goat Island?
Yes, you see there wasn't a causeway, and this channel was kept very deep. And so it would tie up, and sometimes they had quite a job tying it up, because the southeast wind would blow it off the wharf. And they do quite a fancy business with ropes and pulling it in and tying it, pulling it in like that. And then we'd hop off and go up to grandmother's house. And of course, when we went back to Philadelphia at the end of our stay, we'd get all ready and sit out on the porch. And as soon as the Fall River boat came down the harbor from Fall River, you could hear the paddle wheels. And then it came down in the dark. It was 9 o'clock by the time it got here at 9 o'clock. It was just like a great, beautiful wedding cake. It was filled with lights. It was just the most unreal spectacle, this beautiful great white ship with all of these layers and layers of lights. And it would come right down. And once more, it quite often had a hard time tying up because of the wind might push her stern off, or push her bow off. And then there came a tremendous procession, about an hour long. They loaded barrels of fish into the bottom of the boat, into the hold. And so the fish were put on those one-man push cart with 2 wheels at the bottom. What do you call those?
The hand truck.
A hand truck. And they'd push them up the gangway and get them in it. It made a tremendous noise. It would go on for a whole hour. And the barrels all had ice in the top, and then had a tarpaulin nailed onto it. And this was one of the biggest businesses of the Fall River line. Of course, they took a lot of freight down. the Fall River line paid her way, you know. She wasn't. She was one of the few things that paid its way on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railway. It was terrible that she had to be taken off, stopped in 1938. But I guess the war would have put an end to her, even if nothing else had.
Well, transportation was changing.
And, great trucks were taken up.
So the boat would leave at 9. It was supposed to leave at 9 o'clock at night.
9:30, something like that.
And then were you allowed to stay up for a while?
Well, not very, but of course, as we got older, you see, this is something we did all my life, and so as we got older, we did stay up. No, well, the first place when we used to get on the boat in New York, we would have the most wonderful time running around the boat and finding where everything was, finding where the bathrooms were, finding all sorts of passages that we'd forgotten since the last time we came. Of course, there were inner staterooms too. And between an inner stateroom and an outward stateroom, there would be a wonderful little passage. And then, of course, inside the ship, she had balconies inside, and she went way up to I can't tell you which. They don't call them layers. What do they call them?
Decks.
Decks. And then there was always a great, big, beautiful parlor with plush chairs and tables for people to play cards, and it was very exciting.
We've been to that museum over in Fall River a number of times, and one of the things I remember was a card that they had to help you identify the lighthouses as you went down the Sound. Now, do you remember that at all?
No, because we knew a lot of the sounds in the harbor, and we were asleep when we got into the Sound, so we didn't know that. But she'd come in a fog. That's another thing that would happen if you came up in a fog or went down in a fog. I can remember coming up from New York in a fog where the ship had to stop. She had to stop. It was so thick, and all around her you heard the fog whistles of other ships. Because see, there were a lot of ships going up. There was a line that went up to Boston, and there was a line that went right up to Providence. And you'd hear all these wonderful whistle sounds of the different boats. And then finally ours would just begin to go very slowly. But it was amazing the way they could take that traffic up there at night in the fog. You know, Long Island Sound is a foggy place.
That's right.
And then getting around Point Judith was another ticklish point. We were mostly asleep then. We were waked up after that because there was apt to be quite a sea around Point Jude, enough for the boat to be rocking a little, and I'm sure that our parents wanted us to stay asleep and not get any notions of being seasick going around Point Jude.
Another thing at the museum all the things related to, well, we're interested in food anyway, but all of the meals just sound so marvelous with the menus. Do you remember
Well, I don't remember the menus. Maybe we took sandwiches more than I remember. But I do remember the little lamps they had on the tables. Beautiful little Tiffany glass lamps. Some of them were pink, you know, just a little one that sat in the middle of the table. So your table was like this wonderful little discreet dining for a couple of people. It was awfully nice. I remember breakfasts because they had these wonderful black waiters.
Now would this be on the way back to New York?
This is breakfast. So it has to be going back to New York.
Okay.
And they were so immaculate with a white coat and black trousers and always the napkin over here. And breakfast was always cornflakes in a little box. And then rich cream. And I can remember thinking those were the best cornflakes I ever had anywhere. And I think it's because it was just cream that was put on it. Not milk. But
what about after you were married? Did you ever make trips down too?
I made one trip. See, I was married in September, and we went down for Thanksgiving. And of course, in order to do this, we put our car on the boat, and then we could take it off in New York. John had work to people he had to see in New York, and so it was worthwhile to take the car. And I do remember when I went into a stateroom on the Fall River boat with John, I felt very strange because it was the first time I'd ever been into one of those staterooms with a strange man. In Newport, a lot of assignations took part in the Fall River boat.
Oh, no.
A lot of them, yes. A couple would go in the Fall River boat to New York to spend the day in New York. And the reputation was that, you know, you get on there and then you'd meet him on board and you'd go down. Spend the whole day. Think how wonderful. Then you got to New York at 7 o'clock in the morning, fresh as a daisy. Spend the whole day, and then you'd get back on at 6 o'clock. So the Fall River line had the reputation of having
That's
quite
not
a lot
one of my questions
risky
in here.
business.
that's fascinating. So when the line ended, it was a very sad.
A great sorrow, it certainly was. And of course, you see, my husband's uncle worked for the line.
Right.
And I can remember the
Now, was
year
he
of-
working for it when it
in New York. Yes,
died?
Yes, he was. By that time, he was. He went on, though. He worked in the same company. When the first time I went on with my son Thomas, who was a baby, they brought this wonderful, it looked like a square cage with no top. And they hung it on the upper berth. See, it was a little bed. A crib. It was a little crib for Tom, and we could put Tom right in it. It had big hooks, and you could just hang it on the upper berth. It was awfully neat. And of course, John and I got royal treatment on the boat because John knew so many of the people who ran the boat. He'd been a purser one summer.
Oh, he had?
Yes.
Oh.
He'd been a purser for a job during the summer. He was a purser. So
When he
he'd gone
didn't go
back.
to Greece.
Yes.
He had nice
He went, and then he
summers.
could go to the Metropolitan all day in New York.
Oh,
That's
sure.
what he liked, and go visit the museums and roam around New York. That's how he got to know New York.
Now, how did this? Well, the shops, the repair shops, were all
Yes.
down at Longmore
Yes.
for the Fall River line.
There was a great.
Did you
great
ever
big
visit
buildings
that
there.
area? I mean,
No, we didn't visit it, nor did my father. I expect perhaps my younger brother might have gone, but of course by that time, after World War, well, he would have wandered around a little because he was always going into places he wasn't supposed to. My youngest brother, but the rest of us didn't.
Yeah.
You know, things were a little different then. You don't realize how different life was. You didn't have this feeling of being dared to go into places all the time. You know. I feel now that everything says to modern children, don't do this. Don't. You didn't. You were never. There weren't all of these things you didn't do so pronouncedly. I'm not saying it right, but I think this is too philosophical.
You mean you kept busy with
you
things
kept
that
busy,
were
and you didn't do
appropriate
things
or
like
not?
that.
No.
You didn't go into property which didn't belong to you. Private property, no trespassing, was something to which you paid attention. It wasn't like waving a red flag. If there's a sign, private property, no trespassing, that means to the modern kid, let's go in there.
Yeah.
But see, it didn't mean that to us.
Were you aware of the shops being there? Of the
Well, of course we
'cause you
were,
were
because there was often a ship tied up there at Briggs Wharf, which was the nearest one to us, who was undergoing repairs. And they had this great big thing which were called the shears. It was way up in the top. It was really like a great davit, which they could bring a boiler out of one of those ships. It was strong enough to pull it out, hoist it up. It was a hoist. And so you couldn't be aware, and there were lots of noises. There was clanging, hammering, and clanging, and things went on all the time there.
Well, when
Great
the boats
big
came
shop.
in and out, when you were here, staying here, would you say stop what you were doing to watch the
Well, you
boat
always
come
stopped when a
in,
boat
or-
came in. Oh yes, you always stopped and noticed it. You did. But the repair works went on all the time, and a lot of men. You saw the men going in the early morning and coming out at night.
Now, did the neighborhood change? Do you think when the Fall River line ended,
Well,
in terms of how
you see,
the
the war
neighborhood?
came. See, the war came. Then World War II began,
Yeah.
and right away, the torpedo station got tremendously active, and they took Briggs Wharf and put the ferry there. So it did change enormously, and there were huge numbers of cars. People came from Fall River to work in the torpedo station, and it was on 3 shifts, and one shift came in the middle of the night. Must have been, 2 o'clock. And so you heard, the automobiles came into town, and the automobiles went out. And it was, you couldn't possibly not notice it.
Yeah. What about tourists that came on the Fall River line? Were you aware of them at all? Or?
No, I don't think they were tourists. They were people who come to stay for a little while. They'd come.
In the hotels?
It isn't like this. There weren't very many hotels.
Are the boarding houses?
The Viking didn't come up, and it wasn't built until early in just before World War I. I think maybe even 1940. Have you?
I've got
something
that date
like
here somewhere.
But there weren't. Yes, I think people would come and stay in boarding houses. See, there was a boarding house up the street called the Fano, which was an awfully nice.
On Washington Street?
Yes, it was a lovely boarding house. It was across from Mr. and Mrs. Tuckerman's house. It's the property where George Weaver's house is now. It's in the corner of Chestnut and Washington Street. And it was a nice big boarding house with a colonial house stuck on one end of it. And people used to come there. But there were boarding houses, and there were rooms. You could get rooms when I was much younger.
Well, as I understand it, Newport started, one of the reasons people came here was for the healthy sea air. Was this in this day also?
Well, you know, I've just been doing a lot of work on this point, and the summer colony started in 1729. Can you believe that? It did.
Yeah.
Because the sailing ships, the merchant ships, went down the coast and stopped at Charleston. And the people from Charleston wanted to get out of that awful, feverish, miasmic climate in the summer, and they'd come up to Newport. And right straight along, Newport would have a summer colony, and then something like the Civil War would stop it. And then they'd have another one. And so we've right along had a summer colony. But the present summer colony didn't begin to burgeon like this until the late 19th century, when they began to build these houses. There still are white houses, which could rightfully be called cottages. They're white wood with porches. And of course that was the original summer colony. It was much more reasonable.
Well, this is around Catherine and K Street?
Yes, but it's also on parts of Bellevue. But you see a lot of them. They're big, generous wooden houses, Victorian in aspect. But the great big mansions didn't come until, I can't tell you the exact dates, but they were mostly
around 1900, 1902.
Yes, and going into the 1900s. So the picture changed, because then suddenly Newport began to live off the avenue, you might say. Taking care of the property, the gardening, and painting the buildings and refreshing them. You know, you could have your place taken care of then. It wasn't so expensive. You could get, life was simpler for them. So there was a big change in
But I guess my question was, are you aware of this, or was there a feeling that the air here was special, or the healthiness of being near the sea and the salt air?
Well, of course, our family had always felt that way.
Yeah.
And I don't think I remember anybody who came up here for their health. They came up here because they liked sailing and liked it. Oh, my telephone. There was a big change in there. And you see, it's the change between this wonderful, quiet, calm place, which I talk about while we were still going next door. It's really until World War II. It's between the two world wars is what it is. Between 1918 and 1938. Life was much simpler. It stayed lovely and simple. Much more comfortable. There weren't anything like the cars in the city. People were beginning to come, but you can't compare it with now. You just can't. For instance, when I was 16, that's 1924, isn't it? I passed my driver's license up here.
Yeah, you mentioned that Thames Street was two-way at that time.
And Thames Street was able to be two-way, and people could park on the side, but also, and you know that tells you something about traffic.
Sure.
There just wasn't anything like, it wasn't anything like as busy, but the Depression had a lot to do with that.
That's our next subject, is the Depression.
Yeah.
And you already mentioned how that this had a big effect on the summer colony, and that Newport was in
Newport
bad
really
shape.
was in bad shape there.
Now, as I understand it, Newport did better than many cities. Hotel, the Fall River Line, the Torpedo Station, and
well, of course,
that there was a convention trade.
Quite a lot at the War College. Hi, darling. How is he? Here? Is he out on the boat? Did he have a good time?
Yeah.
That's nice.
Just ran down here.
Oh, she's just come back from a trip.
Well,
See, I married in 34. And what you have to realize that I married in between this time. I married in this time when life was so peaceful in Newport. And then in 4 or 5 years, it began to get very much changed because of World War II. And the torpedo station, well, we've done this before.
yeah, right.
But that's really the period of change. And of course, from 24 until 34, the 10 years that we were coming here all summer, this is when I was a teenager, and life was very much more simple.
Were you aware of the federal projects or the?
I was aware of the federal projects.
That helped Newport, help the unemployment in Newport?
I don't think there were very many here. We always had we had some things, but we certainly didn't have an awful lot. I'm trying to remember. Do I remember any of them? The thing you have to realize is that Newport had always been poor, and nobody paid much attention to Newport. It was way down here on the end of this island. Providence was very separate from Newport. In fact, there has been in the past a lot of feeling between Providence and Newport because Newport always felt it was so forgotten by the upstate people. It was a very real division there, and we didn't have any of the things here in Newport that I was used to there being in Philadelphia. Any of the projects to help them. Of course, we've always had a officer, a quarters for the welfare. We've always had welfare here in Newport, but I can't tell you of anything else that we had.
This separation from Providence. Now, was part of that geographic because
I think it's certainly part
because of Aquidneck Island is and that the Mount Hope Bridge was opened in
that was opened before we got married.
29, I think it was.
And of course the Jamestown Saunderstown Bridge was what, 37, 36,
39 or 40. I think it was 40, something 1940, like that, I think.
Yes. So those were those are some of the reasons why the
Did you feel like you were living on an island?
Well, of course, because you had to go on a ferry.
Yeah.
When my mother used to take me up to Providence to call on those relatives, we'd take the ferry.
You mentioned what a long trip it was.
But it was, the ferry made you have much more of a feeling of being an island. But I don't know why this business between Newport and Providence. But I think Providence, from the point of view of the government offices and all of the of that part of life, I think Providence didn't pay much attention to Newport. And Newport would get the short end, is what I really mean. Newport would get the short end because it wasn't this great thriving city that Providence was. Providence had a different kind of pride than we did. But I can't remember anything special for the depressed families. But then you see they weren't specially depressed. The Fall River line went on till 38.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And the fishing went on, and the avenue was just beginning to peter off. There were still people being caretakers and gardeners. It was petering off. It didn't just stop. The avenue didn't just stop. It petered out. And it never died. Never did. There were always a lot of houses. All of those great old girls came. All the Vanderbilt family came. Mrs. Van Allen came. There were a lot of them who never gave up and whose houses have only been sold since the end of World War II. So you really can't say that the Depression hit Newport as much as other places. Newport had been depressed for years.
I hear some people talk about the Depression with a certain, in retrospect, with a certain degree of nostalgia in terms of, well, we made it, or we made do, and because we didn't have certain things, we made a special effort to.
I think that's
do you have
very
any
real.
of that?
Oh yes, I think so many times when Newport is hassling for getting more and more money to run the city, that what Newporters don't realize is that they have what all of these people come to get. And this is another reason why I wish they didn't have to spoil everything by putting up these great condominiums, which take the view from every single person and only give it to the people who're sitting in those rooms on the water side. What Newport is, the waterfront, the sailing, the swimming, and the beautiful houses to go in, it's a special gimmick. And because we have it, we don't need to have as much to live on. See, we've been depressed. We've never had as much to live on as the people in Providence. But that's not because of the Depression. It really wasn't. And I just feel what you said is very true. Newporters know how to get on with less. They have known how to get on with less and still enjoy life. They've had simpler pleasures. And I think it's a great pity that nowadays everybody has to buy so much in order to be happy. And yet, buying stuff, especially you buy it and then you don't use it, it doesn't make you happy. Doing things makes you happy. So the Depression didn't hurt Newport the way it hurt some other people.
Right. What about Prohibition? Do you have any memory?
Prohibition, somebody else can tell you all the excitement of the rum running. Of course, there was a lot of Prohibition here because all of the houses on the avenue had to have their liquor, And Newport had more bars than Providence. Did you know that?
No.
It did. There was one time it had more bars than Providence. Had 90, I think. That's because of all the sailors. And the sailors all just got off the boat and all they wanted to do was get plastered. So we did. We had a lot of fun during that Prohibition because the rum runners would come in to the. Was it the 2-mile limit or the 3-mile limit?
Yeah.
And then boats would come out from Fall River and Providence and meet them out behind that line and load it all into their boats and then come in as fast as they could. And the revenue boats
couldn't go as fast.
Couldn't go as fast. But one reason you could tell was because they'd have 1 or 2 Chrysler engines in the boats. And you could hear that terrible throbbing. The minute they'd get around up here, the ones that were coming from upriver, you could hear them at night. And then searchlights would be going. Searchlights to see what kind of a boat it was. But then they all went out at sea. The searching of a boat didn't take place in here. But the searchlights hunting for boats did. Oh, it was very exciting.
Was this something that you and your friends looked on with bemusement, or
yes.
with
it was lots of fun. And sometimes you'd be walking on some of the beaches around out the Ocean Drive, and you'd find a bottle of something.
Oh.
You felt that when they were unloading, a bottle had fallen overboard.
When smugglers were caught, do you think people sympathized with them, or?
Oh, I'm sure they did.
What about speakeasies? Were you aware of them, or?
No, that's funny. I'm not aware of them at all. But then that's because I didn't go to them. I didn't make any attempt to go to them. Certain restaurants you knew you could get liquor at.
Yeah.
That's more like what it was. Although Newport didn't have many restaurants. That's one of the things that you look back. Newport had no decent restaurants. It didn't have any. There wasn't anywhere you could take somebody to go out to dinner. There was a Munchinger King Hotel. That would serve a nice meal. And finally,
that was up on Toro Street.
It's across from Viking.
Right,
Viking.
yeah, okay.
Not quite across. But there weren't any of these wonderful places to eat. It was terrible. You couldn't take somebody out to dinner. There were a couple of Italian spaghetti places, but that's all. I should tell you a wonderful story about my husband. And there was a wonderfully nice woman named Mrs. Walter Belknap James. And my husband had done her husband's gravestone, and so he knew her quite well. And of course, she enjoyed him. He was lots of fun. And one day she said to him, would he take her out to an Italian restaurant? She'd never been to one. She was very anxious. Well, there was one across from the post office. So they made a date to meet and go, and he said to her, now, will you please not wear any of your jewelry? This isn't a very good neighborhood that we're going to. We're really better now. So they went into I think it was called the Venetian Gardens, and sat down at a table, and she took her gloves off, and she had a diamond as big as a marble. He used to tell that story.
That's wonderful.
See, he knew a lot of the people on the avenue because he made their gravestones.
Oh.
And then he was such fun, they often would invite him to meals. This is before we were married. So he was quite, I don't know what to call it. People liked to have him come to meals. He was great fun. A bachelor, that was invited to meals.
Yeah.
In fact, he was supposed to have forgotten and left his hat at more houses on the avenue than anybody else. And the butler was always calling up and saying, I believe this is Mr. Benson's hat.
I noticed in the paper last week that you were going to be on the radio on
Yes, I was on
Wednesday,
the
and we
Wednesday.
were not home at
You
the
were
time.
swimming.
Yes, we were swimming, and so that
You
was
missed
too bad. But how did that go?
Well, I didn't think I did it very well, to tell the truth. So, I guess it went all right. I thought it was going to be an hour long, half an hour long, and so I wrote everything about the early John Stevens shop, and then it was a whole other half hour. So I had to put.
Oh,
the
I could have
modern
told
shop
you it
in,
was an hour.
and I just had to pull it out of my head. And I
Yeah.
kept saying, "Oh, I've forgotten this. Oh, well, and this year we did that," and I thought it was very poor. But still, I did it. Got a lot of stuff in.
Well, I was sorry that we missed it. Anything else on the Depression that any particular vivid memory you have of? What about there was a shooting and some people? Well, I've forgotten the name of the ship now, but there was a couple of people were killed by the Coast Guard.
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I remember the boys that drowned when one of their gigs dumped, and that
Oh.
was awfully sad. The sailors. It was one cold November night and the heavy wind, and they were all getting back to their destroyers, and one of the boats tipped over, and I think 2 boys were drowned. Sailors. I remember that, but I don't remember the shooting. I remember that in 1934, when John and I were married, we lived on $143 a month. That was his salary from the School of Design. Can you believe that?
And you did it.
Well, once more, you made do. You managed to cut your corners and be more frugal and make things go farther than we do now, because you had to.
Yeah.
That's easy enough.
All right, well, let's go on to the hurricane of 1938,
Hurricane of
September
1938.
21st. Now, you did have some wonderful descriptions of what was going out in front of your house and some of the damage. And you were living in
Yes,
this
it was
house
right
at the
here.
time, and you were here. And I do know from the reading that I've done that there was no warning. And
My
it was
husband
high
wrote- yeah,
tide, and it was the autumnal equinox,
21st.
and
My husband drove to Providence to the School of Design that morning.
oh my.
He went off in the morning, and I was here with Tom,
Uh-huh.
who was just past 2. He'd been 2 in July. And my husband's partner was up at the John Stevens shop working. He'd come down from Boston to work. And so it was a very strange morning. The water wasn't the right color. The water was sort of a greeny brown, not dark, light. And the wind began blowing early in the morning, and quite a few little sailboats were sailed in and put somewhere. I don't know where they were put. But the wind began going, and a lot of these little boats were having trouble. But by about 2 o'clock, I guess even before 2 o'clock, the tide hadn't gone down. It was way, way up everywhere. And then suddenly this whistling started. And it's strange that something you can't see, like the wind, can make a noise so loud. And it just whistled. And where the spray was pulled up out of the water, you couldn't see clearly out there because it was so filled with spray from the wind taking the top off the water. And Tom and I were sitting at a window in there. And first one tree fell down on that side of the house. And then another one fell down here. And it's so peculiar when a tree falls, it doesn't make a loud noise because its branches cushion it. And it comes down gently. I can remember being I just couldn't even think. I was so astonished by this. And the waves got higher and higher and were breaking in the yard and breaking over the pier. And a great freighter blew down and knocked against quite near the lighthouse, a little south of the lighthouse.
The Goat Island Lighthouse?
Yes,
Yeah.
knocked. I can't remember her name, the Pequot, I think it was. And all of the little boats went down, all the little boats tied out here, all went right down, and my husband's, he didn't have a catboat then, I didn't have to worry about that. And
Now what time, when did he come back that night?
at about 2:30, I got very upset about his coming back. And I wanted to call him up at the school. I knew his classes weren't over until 3, to tell him not to try to come back. And I called the partner at the shop, and the partner said, "Oh, this is just a fall storm. This is just the equinox storm. Don't worry about it." And he was really very unimpressed by the storm. Up there in 10th Street he was. And I tried to call John, but I couldn't get him. And then about a half an hour later, my husband's partner looked out the front door and saw the water coming up 10th Street, and he came home and helped me. And we closed all the inside shutters in the house and did what we could to make us not so vulnerable to the wind. But by this time the breakers were up in the yard. And by the peak of the hurricane, the breakers were breaking right onto my porch. And the cellar was filled with water. We had a great wing to the house out there, to the west, which had been a wonderful big cellar where I had my great iron stove that I was talking about the other day,
yeah.
my range and my hot water heater. And of course the wind, that was filled with water. It was up to about this height on me. And it was really you couldn't think you couldn't do a sensible thing because of the noise and the disorder and all of this.
How scared were you?
I wasn't scared at all. Isn't that funny? Look, I wasn't on the water. Do you see what I mean? I was safe. I mean, things were happening, but I was not in any peril myself. I did worry about John, but I thought he must have had enough sense not to come down.
Did you stay in the house the
Yes.
whole time then?
I stayed in the house. I didn't go out.
And it was just you and the baby?
Yes, and my aunt was next door. Esther Morton Smith was.
Oh, okay.
And I think once or twice we communicated. I can't remember whether she came over or not. But it was really, then finally Tom and I went to sleep upstairs, and we were awakened by the silence of the eye of the storm. The eye of the storm came, and suddenly the wind dropped and there was no sound. And that was very strange. And then it started again, of course. And we went back to sleep. We were dazed by it. And I remember it was peculiar because Tom was so good. My son Thomas was a very hyperactive child. And for him to be good tells you something, because he just sat also. He was just in a daze from it. And when we woke up in the morning and went out, the yard was filled with debris. All of the city pier was in our backyard. All of the railings and all the boarding was in it, and there were broken pieces of sailboats everywhere. The destruction was absolutely terrible. There were, of course, I had 2 trees down. There were trees down all over the streets, and then people began walking. People came out and they walked all over to see everything. So there were crowds all over everywhere, and wherever you went there was somebody you could talk to and commiserate with. And in the meantime I didn't know where John was, but about noon he got here. And he had left the School of Design early. He realized something terrible was happening. He'd left it quite early, I would think, as early as 2 o'clock or maybe 1:30. And he tried to get down to the Mount Hope Bridge. And in order to do it, he would over and over again have had to drive around a fallen tree. And when he got down there, they wouldn't let him on the bridge. So he drove back to Providence once more, doing this awful business. And he drove all the way around and went to Tiverton. And by then, the Tiverton Bridge had gone. And he saw they had a little, sort of a little cabin where the man stood who worked the drawbridge for the railway. And he saw that little house float up the river. And so he once more tried to get back to Providence. And by that time, all of the little creeks which came into the bay were so high that the bridge wouldn't work. And so he stayed all night in a little roadhouse there and didn't get down until 12 o'clock the next day. But it was funny, he was so astonished by what he had seen that he hadn't even thought of what might be happening here. At least he never told me that he had. Because he'd been in the throes of it. So, and I think this is what happens to you in a great primitive disaster like that.
So you didn't go out and see what was happening until the next day?
No, and the reason you don't is because that's danger. You see, if you go out, you get in danger. And of course, lots of people, when a storm like that starts, they want to go around and watch it. But that's just courting death, and quite a few people were drowned out there. Of course, the police routed Newporters to get out of Newport by First Beach because there were so many trees that had fallen down. See, we had so many elm trees, we lost a great many elm trees, and they all went down. And of course, in routing them by First Beach, that's where the great water came in. And there were several drownings over there, and automobiles were covered with water, just because of this not knowing the patterns of hurricanes.
I understand they called out the civil defense. Do you remember that at all?
No, I don't. But you can see I was right here, and I didn't go away.
And the lack of power, how long did you go without power?
Well, we didn't go as long as some people, because the electric line was the same one that connected the Naval Hospital. And so we were put back quite quickly, more quickly than some people. We got our electricity back. I can't tell you when it was.
What about looting? Were you aware?
There wasn't any looting here. But then I was here. Why would they? And there was so much everywhere. But it wasn't damage to houses here. It was damage to boats.
And the trees.
And the trees. And the boats were knocked into pieces. What could you loot from a boat that's knocked to pieces? I mean, the heavy things fell to the bottom. Oh, it was
Did the hurricane change your life?
Well,
in
we went
any
up.
way?
Yes, we went up to Providence, and we got an apartment in Providence.
Oh, that's right. You mentioned
and I
that,
stayed
right.
up there for 2 winters. We went up there. My husband was organizing the sculpture department of the School of Design, but I don't think we had quite decided what to do until the hurricane came, and then we just.
What about in a long-term way? Has the hurricane changed? Did it change your life in any way in terms of the way you do things in the fall, or listen to the radio in a storm?
Well, it certainly does make you listen to the radio in the storm. And then, of course, we have
and then they didn't realize how bad it was. But
but there was tremendous publicity. I mean, people talked about it for months. And the School of the Providence Journal had wonderful pictures.
Yes,
people
and they
turned
put
in
out
their
books
pictures.
and-
Yes, they put out books, and it was a long time before we could forget it. And then, of course, we began to have more of them. We had some in the 40s, and these were very carefully monitored. And there wasn't anything like the death. Of course, there was an awful lot of death over there in the South County beaches because people had built their houses on the barrier beaches, and they just were washed down like matchsticks. And there was a lot of drowning.
And then
over
in
there.
Jamestown, those school children.
The school children. Wasn't that terrible?
Yeah.
Oh, terrible. But see, it's ignorance, not knowing what a hurricane is.
Do you know, or did you know any families that had anyone who died in the hurricane?
No, I don't think I did. I'm sure I didn't know anybody who did.
What's the most unusual or dramatic story that you can remember from the hurricane?
Well, I think the one you just told about Jamestown is about the worst one, where the children were drowned. I think that was terrible. And then, of course, the girl who left the house out there. It's called Hurricane Hut. It's on the Ocean Drive. It's being made into condominiums. A great big beautiful house right in the waterfront. It's near that inland pond where there used to be the great big circular concrete balls. Do you remember? Well, anyway, this was a secretary of the family who lived there, and she waited too late to leave. And then when the waves began breaking on the back of the house, she got in her car and left. And when she got to this place where there are two little ponds, the water just came right in from the sea, and she was drowned. I think that's a terrible one, because she'd have been all right if she'd stayed in the house.
Yeah.
It was a great big stone-built house. Nothing would have taken it down. And yet she left too late to get out.
How about the rebuilding or repair afterwards? Do you have any memories?
Well, it
of
just
how
went
that
on
was
like
done?
mad. It just went on like mad, and it was hard to get it done. And every carpenter in the city was busy, and there was an awful lot of rebuilding that went on. And of course, we had to have the insurance company. The insurance company were so busy; they were here all the time. And I can remember and how they wouldn't give you insurance for water damage. Your insurance didn't cover sea damage, that kind of water damage. And how we all were so upset to find that our policies didn't. We lost our widow's walk off the house.
Hmm.
And we used the money we got for that to repair our pier, because we couldn't, and none of our insurance covered the pier. And we thought the pier was more important to us than the widow's walk. But the whole back end of that room where I said the stove was gone. That was all washed in, and it all had to be put together again. Everybody, the fences were gone. Fences went all along the street. Everybody was repairing. We were all in it together. Just endless things happened. We were saved a lot by being able to close the shutters. That helped my house.
Do you think it brought people in the community closer together?
Yes,
the
I think
sharing
it
this
always
crisis
does, yes.
and
It certainly did.
yeah.
And then of course we began to make fun of our hurricane stories. Oh, haven't you heard so and so's hurricane story? Everybody had a better
There's a
one than
wonderful
everybody
one
else.
in Boston of a guy in the Commons there who said, "I'll listen to your hurricane story for 25 cents."
Isn't that funny?
Yeah.
And of course we had no idea what happened up the coast.
Yeah.
Because this one went right through Connecticut. It was really terrible. It took us days to get all of the information. We never did get it all.
Yeah. Do you think the hurricane changed Newport permanently?
I wish it had. You know what it did? It hasn't done? It hasn't taught them any lessons about not building on the waterfront.
Yeah.
And here in Newport, we're building great things right in the waterfront. And many a person has said to me this summer, "Oh, I wish we had a hurricane to knock some of these things down." I think it did. I think it made us much more cautious about weather. But it hasn't lasted because, see, it's another generation. The generation that lived through the hurricane is beginning to get quite thin. And so I don't think you can say it has. It did for a while. But now they don't believe it. They just don't believe what happens when you have one of those things. But still, we had them for about, it was more than 10 years, because I think the last one was 54.
Well, it was in the 60s. There were a couple too, I think. 54 was
54 was another bad one.
Carol, was it? Or?
Carol and Edna and Mabel. There were 3 that year, but the only one. See, why the 38 was so bad was because it came with a high tide.
And it was people weren't prepared.
And the people weren't
there
prepared.
hadn't been a big hurricane since 1815, so no one in anyone's living memory was there an awareness.
Of course, you have to realize that the bay filled up as if somebody were running a spigot into it. The whole bay filled right up. The water went right straight up to Providence because more was coming.
That's right. Well, Providence had a terrible time.
Terrible time.
Yeah. Now, I was just reading about how there was talk in the 60s of building a hurricane dike across
Well, I think that was even before, very early on that was.
But this
yes,
was in the
Army,
60s.
The Army Corps of Engineers was going to do it. But they worked it all out with a scale model, quite small. And I don't think they had any conception either of what a hurricane would be like. And it had to have, this thing that they were going to build would have had to have openings for Navy vessels, and it would have been very difficult.
It sounds like it would have been.
And we didn't want it. We thought it would change the currents in the bay and spoil the bay, and so Newporters didn't want it.
No.
We turned it down. And then, of course, they have got that pair of gates up in Providence, which I think probably is sensible. It encloses a much smaller passage there. But still, it was... Then the 54 hurricane, which was also very bad, did not come with the high tide.
Right.
So our little sailboat, we did have a sailboat in the first one, but the water was deep enough, she sank, but she wasn't hurt. See, she didn't hit the bottom. But in the 54 hurricane with a low tide, our little boat beat the bottom and beat the bottom and beat the bottom. It was beaten up and down by the waves, although it didn't, her mooring rope didn't break. It was awful to see what happened to all the little sailboats. Awful. But I don't think the remembrance of a thing like that exists after the people have died who lived through it. It seems so to me.
Okay, well, I think that takes care of the hurricane, and the next subject is World War II and the torpedo station. So maybe we should just
Stop now.
Stop now.
I think maybe we should too.
Okay.